Everything you were taught is wrong. Hidden mysteries have forced entire textbooks to be rewritten after discoveries that defy explanation. Strange artifacts appear where they should not exist, and forbidden archives remain sealed. What was uncovered still terrifies experts today, leaving unanswered questions that challenge everything we think we know. On the windswept strip of land between two dark Scottish lochs on the Orkney mainland, stone emerges from the soil in an ordered complexity that feels almost deliberate in its precision. This is the site known as Ness of Brodgar, a sprawling Neolithic complex that lies quietly within a landscape already rich with prehistoric memory. At first glance, it does not announce itself as extraordinary. Low stone walls trace outlines across the earth, partially reclaimed by grass and time. Yet as excavation has continued over the past decades, a different picture has taken shape. This was not a simple settlement, nor a single structure, but a vast ceremonial landscape active between roughly 3,300 BC and 2,300 BC. Walls rise and intersect in carefully planned geometry. Enclosures appear layered, rebuilt, modified again and again across centuries. Archaeologists have uncovered more than a dozen major structures within the site, along with paved pathways and what appear to be defensive or boundary walls, some as thick as would be expected in much later fortified architecture. The density of construction is striking. Unlike scattered dwellings, this is a tightly organized complex, suggesting repeated gatherings of significant scale. Inside the buildings, excavations reveal finely made stone objects, carved stone balls with intricate symmetry, polished axes of volcanic rock, and decorated slabs etched with geometric motifs. Some stones bear incised patterns that repeat across structures, almost like a shared visual language. Yet its meaning remains uncertain. Were these symbols decorative, territorial, ritualistic, or something else entirely? The site's architecture raises further questions. Massive central buildings, such as Structure 10, show evidence of monumental construction techniques, carefully shaped stone slabs, internal benches, and central hearths that suggest controlled, communal use. The scale of effort required to build and rebuild such structures over generations implies a society deeply committed to whatever purpose this place served. But what that purpose was remains open to interpretation. Mainstream archaeological understanding frames the Ness of Brodgar as a ceremonial and communal center within a wider Neolithic landscape that includes nearby sites like the Ring of Brodgar and Skara Brae. It is often described as a hub for ritual activity, feasting, and gathering, a place where scattered farming communities came together. Evidence of animal bones and cooking remains supports the idea of large communal events, possibly seasonal or cyclical in nature. Yet not all aspects fit neatly into this interpretation. The repeated reconstruction of buildings, sometimes deliberately dismantled and replaced, suggests a ritualized cycle of destruction and renewal. Some walls appear to have been carefully closed off rather than abandoned. Why invest such immense labor into structures only to reshape or erase them again? There are also questions about sound and space. Certain architectural features seem to emphasize acoustics, with narrow entrances and enclosed chambers that could amplify voices or ritual activity. Was this intentional design for ceremonies, or simply a byproduct of construction methods shaped by available materials and tradition? More speculative interpretations have occasionally emerged. Some researchers and enthusiasts have wondered whether the site functioned as a kind of astronomical or cosmological center, aligning human activity with celestial cycles. Others have suggested it may have been a meeting place for dispersed communities to negotiate identity, belief, and power through ritual performance. These ideas remain debated, resting at the edges of evidence and interpretation. And still, beneath all of this analysis, the deeper question persists. Why here, and why in this form? The Orkney landscape holds many Neolithic sites, yet the Ness of Brodgar stands apart in its density and complexity. It feels both familiar and unfamiliar at once, clearly human in origin, yet difficult to fully decode in intention. Even after years of excavation, most of the site still lies unexposed beneath the soil, its full extent unknown. Each new season reveals more walls, more artifacts, more fragments of a society speaking through stone but not entirely explaining itself. What remains, then, is a quiet uncertainty. Was this place a temple, a gathering ground, a cosmological map carved into architecture, or something that does not fit any modern category at all? And as the earth continues to yield its secrets slowly, one question lingers without resolution. How much of its story is still waiting, unspoken, beneath the ground? From the monumental stone corridors of Tiryns, where Cyclopean walls still hold the memory of Bronze Age power, the journey moves north and west once more, across Europe, across centuries of shifting kingdoms and forgotten migrations. The landscape softens again into the green and mist-laced countryside of eastern England, where the earth itself once concealed one of the most extraordinary discoveries in early medieval archaeology. Here, near the River Deben in Suffolk, lies Sutton Hoo. At first glance, it is an unassuming series of grassy mounds rising gently from the ground. Sheep graze across them. Wind moves through tall grass. There is nothing immediately visible to suggest that beneath this quiet landscape rests one of the richest archaeological finds ever uncovered in northern Europe. Yet beneath one of these mounds, time was carefully sealed away. In 1939, excavations revealed a ship burial unlike anything previously seen in Anglo-Saxon archaeology. A large wooden vessel, nearly 27 meters long, had been hauled from the nearby river and set into a prepared trench. The wood itself had long decayed, but its imprint remained in the sand, preserved as a ghostly outline. Within this impression lay an extraordinary collection of grave goods, arranged with deliberate care. A ceremonial helmet, reconstructed from fragments, emerged as one of the most iconic objects of early medieval Europe. Its iron framework and intricate mask-like face evoke both martial authority and ritual symbolism. Alongside it were weapons, shields, gold buckles, ornate shoulder clasps, and finely crafted objects of silver and garnet cloisonné. A great gold belt buckle, heavy and complex in design, suggested craftsmanship that connected this burial to wide networks of trade and cultural exchange. The burial is often associated with a ruler of the East Anglian kingdom, likely dating to the early 7th century A.D. Historical interpretation frequently links it to King Radwald, though certainty remains elusive. The richness of the grave goods suggests a figure of immense status, someone whose power extended beyond local authority into broader regional influence. Yet what makes Sutton Hoo so compelling is not only the wealth of the burial, but its silence. No body was conclusively identified. The acidic soil of the region may have dissolved organic remains, leaving only traces of a presence that once commanded this elaborate farewell. Was this truly a burial, or a symbolic cenotaph, an empty monument created to project memory and legitimacy rather than contain physical remains? The absence invites interpretation. The ship itself raises further questions. Transporting such a large vessel inland and burying it intact required extraordinary coordination. It was not simply placed in the earth, it was ceremonially arranged, as if the ship itself were meant to carry its occupant into another realm. But what understanding of death or passage guided this act? Was it purely political symbolism, religious belief, or something that merged both into a single worldview now partially lost? Mainstream archaeology interprets Sutton Hoo as a high-status royal burial, reflecting the emergence of complex Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in post-Roman Britain. The grave goods demonstrate connections stretching across Europe and beyond. Byzantine silver, Frankish garnet work, and locally crafted items influenced by continental styles. It was a world far more interconnected than once assumed for the so-called early medieval period. And yet, certain elements resist easy categorization. The helmet's design, for example, with its stylized warrior imagery, suggests not only protection but transformation. The face it presents is both human and symbolic, almost mask-like, as though the wearer, or the remembered figure, was meant to exist between identities. Was this armor, ritual regalia, or something intended to represent kingship itself as a mythic state? The arrangement of the burial also hints at deliberate staging. Objects were not scattered randomly, but placed with structured intent. Weapons grouped, treasures aligned, and ceremonial items positioned as though participating in a narrative understood by those who created the burial. But that narrative is no longer fully readable. Some alternative interpretations, while not widely accepted in academic circles, have explored the possibility that such ship burials represent more than elite funerary practice. Could they reflect remnants of older ritual traditions, perhaps inherited from earlier maritime cultures where ships symbolized passage not just into death, but into transformation or rebirth? Others have suggested that the scale and precision of such burials imply ceremonial knowledge systems that combined astronomy, kingship, and myth into a unified worldview. Even within established scholarship, Sutton Hoo continues to evolve in meaning. New analyses of the artifacts, metallurgy, and cultural context regularly refine our understanding of how this burial fits into the broader early medieval landscape. It is no longer seen as an isolated phenomenon, but part of a wider tradition of elite ship burials found across northern Europe and Scandinavia, though Sutton Hoo remains the most elaborate of its kind discovered in England. Still, the emotional impact of the site resists full explanation. Standing among the burial mounds today, the ground appears almost ordinary again, reclaimed by nature and time. Yet beneath it lies a carefully constructed moment of human intention, preserved for more than a millennium. It is a message encoded in earth and artifact, partially deciphered but never fully translated. Why was such immense effort devoted to this single act of burial? Was it meant to ensure remembrance, to assert legitimacy, or to communicate with forces beyond the visible world? And if so, how much of that message has truly been recovered, and how much still remains, quietly embedded beneath the soil waiting for a language we have yet to rediscover? From the quiet burial mounds of Sutton Hoo in eastern England, where a ship once carried a forgotten ruler into the earth, the journey shifts once again, this time across continents, across seas, and far deeper into the layered origins of early civilization. The landscape changes, but the sense of buried intention remains. Stone gives way to dust, grass to sun-baked soil, and the silence of northern Europe is replaced by the heat and tension of the ancient Near East. In the highlands of northern Palestine, near the upper reaches of the Galilee, rises the archaeological mound known as Hazor. Unlike a natural hill, this is a tell, a mound formed over thousands of years by successive layers of human occupation, destruction, and rebuilding. Each stratum is a chapter sealed beneath the next, compressing entire centuries into compressed earth and broken stone. From a distance, Hazor appears unremarkable, a broad, elevated plateau surrounded by fields and modern settlement. Yet beneath its surface lies one of the largest and most significant urban centers of the ancient Levant. Archaeological surveys suggest that at its height during the Bronze Age, Hazor was not a village or small fortified town, but a sprawling city covering hundreds of acres and housing tens of thousands of inhabitants. Excavations have revealed massive fortifications, thick city walls, gates designed with complex chamber systems, and administrative buildings that suggest centralized authority. Within the upper city, palatial structures once stood, their foundations still visible in stone alignments and fragmented architecture. Below and around it stretched a lower city, indicating urban expansion beyond a simple citadel into a fully developed metropolis. Historical records from ancient Mesopotamia mention Hazor explicitly. In texts from Mari and other Near Eastern archives, it is described as a powerful city-state engaged in trade, diplomacy, and regional politics. It was not isolated, but part of a vast network of Bronze Age civilizations that connected Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant through commerce and correspondence. One of the most intriguing aspects of Hazor is its repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Archaeological layers show evidence of a major destruction event around the late 13th century BC. Entire sections of the city were burned. Walls collapsed. Storage jars were shattered in place, suggesting sudden collapse rather than gradual abandonment. The cause of this destruction remains debated. Mainstream interpretations often connect this layer to broader regional instability during the late Bronze Age collapse, a period marked by the fall of major civilizations, disruptions in trade networks, and widespread urban decline across the eastern Mediterranean. Some scholars associate Hazor's destruction with conflict involving emerging groups in ancient Palestine, as referenced in later textual traditions, though the archaeological record itself does not preserve a single definitive account of the event. What remains are the material traces: ash layers, broken pottery, fallen columns, and the quiet geometry of a city abruptly interrupted. And yet, Hazor is not defined solely by its destruction. Earlier layers reveal a sophisticated urban center with administrative order and architectural ambition. Massive orthostats, large stone slabs, line the entrances of important buildings. Courtyards open into structured spaces that suggest ritual or governmental function. The scale of construction implies not only technical skill, but sustained political organization capable of mobilizing labor across generations. Some of the most striking finds include cultic objects, altars, standing stones, and figurines that hint at religious practices embedded within the city's daily life. These artifacts suggest a worldview in which political authority and spiritual structure were deeply intertwined. But the precise nature of these beliefs remains only partially understood. What gods were invoked here? What ceremonies once filled these empty courtyards? The complexity of Hazor also lies in its contradictions. It was a powerful city, yet it rose and fell multiple times. It was a center of administration, yet its archives have not been recovered in the same way as those of neighboring civilizations. It was destroyed in fire, yet rebuilt, sometimes on top of its own ruins, as if continuity mattered as much as collapse. Some alternative interpretations, outside mainstream archaeology, have occasionally suggested that the scale and suddenness of destruction layers across sites like Hazor point to events that are not yet fully understood. These range from hypotheses about regional seismic activity or accidental chain reactions of urban fires to more speculative ideas about coordinated military campaigns whose historical records have been lost or fragmented over time. None of these interpretations stand conclusively, but they reflect the persistent effort to explain abrupt transitions in the archaeological record. Even within academic circles, certain questions remain open. Why did such a major urban center, deeply embedded in regional networks, fail to maintain continuity? Was its destruction part of a wider systemic breakdown, or the result of specific historical conflicts that have only partially survived in later memory and text? Walking through the ruins today, the city does not feel entirely gone. Foundations outline streets that once carried movement and commerce. Gate complexes still frame the empty horizon as if expecting arrival. Beneath the soil, further layers remain unexcavated, preserving earlier phases of occupation that may yet alter the current understanding of the site. There is also the quiet presence of time itself, compressed, stacked, and layered so densely that a single step across the tell can traverse centuries. Unlike isolated monuments, Hazor is not a frozen moment, but a living accumulation of many moments, each built upon the last, each partially erased, yet never fully removed. And so the questions remain suspended within the earth. What kind of society could build, destroy, and rebuild such a city across generations? What forces led to its sudden collapse in the late Bronze Age, and why do its stories survive only in fragments, scattered across stone, text, and soil? As excavation continues, Hazor offers no final narrative, only deeper stratification. And beneath its layers, still untouched in places, one question lingers in the silence of the ancient ground. How much of this city's true history is still waiting, buried beneath what we have only just begun to uncover? From the layered remains of Hazor, where entire cities rise and fall beneath the soil like chapters sealed in earth, the narrative shifts once more. The heat of the ancient Near East fades, replaced by a colder wind that moves across stone, grass, and open horizon. Civilization seems to stretch thin here, drawn into a long boundary line carved across northern Britain. In this landscape, where rolling hills meet sudden ridges and valleys cut through the land like quiet scars, emerges one of the most striking architectural statements of the Roman world: Hadrian's Wall. It does not rise like a city or temple. Instead, it extends, linear, deliberate, and vast, cutting across the terrain for more than 110 kilometers from coast to coast. At first encounter, it can feel less like a single structure and more like an idea made visible. Stone courses follow the spine of the land, adapting to its contours rather than ignoring them. In some places, the wall stands tall and imposing. In others, only its foundation remains, softened by time and weather. Yet even in its fragmented state, the intention behind it remains unmistakable: control, separation, and observation. Constructed beginning in AD 122 under the rule of Emperor Hadrian, the wall marked the northern frontier of the Roman province of Britannia. It was not merely a barrier, but a complex system of military architecture. Mile castles were placed at regular intervals, each functioning as a controlled entry point. Between them stood turrets for surveillance. Larger forts housed garrisons of soldiers who lived, trained, and maintained the frontier over generations. But what makes Hadrian's Wall particularly compelling is not only its engineering, but the experience it creates when encountered in person. It does not behave like a natural boundary. It interrupts it. It crosses rivers, climbs ridges, and cuts through terrain that offers no obvious strategic logic from a purely modern perspective. And yet, it was built with remarkable precision, using thousands of soldiers, engineers, and laborers over years of sustained effort. Archaeological evidence reveals a living frontier rather than a static barrier. At forts such as Vindolanda, tablets written in ink have survived, offering glimpses into daily life on the edge of the Roman world: supply requests, personal correspondence, military reports. These fragments show that the wall was not simply a defensive structure against an external unknown, but a complex zone of interaction, trade, negotiation, and cultural exchange. And yet, despite this clarity of purpose, the deeper question remains: why here? The northern boundary of Roman Britain was not fixed by geography alone. Beyond the wall lay other communities, landscapes, and shifting tribal territories, often referred to in Roman sources with varying degrees of generalization. The wall, therefore, represents not just a military decision, but a conceptual one, a line drawn through a landscape that was already inhabited, already known, yet redefined through imperial perspective. Mainstream historical interpretation views Hadrian's Wall as a strategic frontier designed to regulate movement, project power, and stabilize the northern edge of Roman control. It was less about absolute exclusion and more about managed interaction. Gates allowed passage. Forts facilitated trade. The wall structured, rather than completely blocked, the flow between worlds. But even within this framework, certain elements invite quieter reflection. The sheer scale of coordination required to build and maintain the wall raises questions about logistical organization in the Roman Empire. Quarries had to be managed, stone transported, garrison rotations maintained across long distances, supply chains extended back into the heart of the province. How did such a system remain stable in a region often described as remote and challenging? There is also the psychological dimension of the wall itself. Standing beside it today, one senses not only separation, but perspective. To the south, Roman order and administration. To the north, a landscape that was perceived differently by Roman writers, less documented, more fluid in their descriptions. But what did the wall mean to those who lived beyond it? Was it a boundary, a barrier, a line of negotiation, or something more symbolic in nature? Some alternative interpretations, often discussed outside mainstream archaeology, suggest that frontier systems like Hadrian's Wall may have carried meanings beyond the strictly military. Could such structures have functioned as instruments of identity, reinforcing a sense of inside and outside, not only politically, but culturally and psychologically? Others have speculated whether the wall reflects an ancient understanding of landscape control that blends practical engineering with symbolic assertion of order over uncertainty. Even within academic study, the wall continues to generate new questions. Its later history shows periods of reuse, abandonment, and reoccupation. It did not simply function for a short span and disappear. Instead, it remained part of the landscape's evolving memory, influencing settlement patterns and historical imagination long after Roman administration declined in Britain. Walking along its surviving sections today, one moves through a landscape where time feels layered rather than linear. Sheep graze beside stones once placed by imperial engineers. Moss grows over carved blocks that once defined a frontier. The wall no longer separates an empire from what lies beyond it, yet it still shapes how the land is experienced. And perhaps that is part of its enduring presence, not as a boundary of control, but as a reminder of how civilizations attempt to define space, movement, and meaning through stone. Yet even now, after centuries of study and preservation, Hadrian's Wall does not fully resolve into a single interpretation. It remains at once practical and symbolic, precise and ambiguous, familiar and strangely distant. What then does it truly represent? A frontier of empire, a system of governance, a statement of power, or something more complex that modern categories only partially capture? And as the wall continues to stretch across the landscape in fragments and silence, one question remains suspended in its long, fading line. What did those who built it believe they were truly separating? And what, if anything, was ever meant to be understood on the other side? From the long Roman frontier of Hadrian's Wall, where stone once traced an empire's idea of order across a distant landscape, the journey now crosses an ocean and an entirely different world of earth and silence. The sense of boundaries remains, but here they are shaped not by imperial Rome, but by desert wind, canyon light, and the slow geometry of ancient adobe rising from arid soil. In the remote northern reaches of what is now Mexico, near the modern borderlands of the southwestern United States, lies Paquimé, also known as Casas Grandes. At first approach, the site appears almost absorbed by its environment. The desert stretches outward in muted tones of sand, scrub, and stone. Yet emerging from this landscape are the remains of a once complex urban center, its structures built not from cut stone or marble, but from earth itself, adobe shaped into walls, rooms, and multi-story dwellings. Unlike the monumental stone cities of other ancient worlds, Paquimé rises in softer form. Its architecture is organic in appearance, as though the settlement grew from the ground rather than being imposed upon it. Multi-level buildings once stood here, with hundreds of interconnected rooms arranged in dense, labyrinthine clusters. Narrow passages wind between structures, opening into courtyards, plazas, and ceremonial spaces that suggest both communal life and structured social organization. Archaeological evidence places the peak of Paquimé between approximately AD 1200 and 1450, during a period of extensive cultural interaction across the broader Oasis America region. It was not an isolated settlement, but part of a network of trade and communication that linked Mesoamerican civilizations with northern desert cultures. Goods such as macaw feathers, copper bells, marine shells, and finely crafted pottery have been found at the site, objects that traveled vast distances across harsh and diverse landscapes. One of the most striking features of Paquimé is its water management system. In an environment where survival depends on careful control of scarce resources, the inhabitants engineered canals, reservoirs, and drainage systems integrated directly into the architecture. Water was not merely collected, it was directed, distributed, and managed with an understanding of environmental balance that still draws admiration today. How did such precision emerge in a landscape so unforgiving, where rainfall is irregular and rivers are often seasonal or absent? Within the ruins, researchers have also uncovered evidence of specialized production areas. Workshops suggest the crafting of pottery at a scale and refinement unusual for the region. Some ceramics display intricate geometric patterns and symbolic motifs whose meanings remain partially understood. The repetition of certain designs across vessels and architectural spaces hints at a shared symbolic language, one that may have structured identity, trade, or belief systems within the community. And yet, despite the clarity of its physical remains, Paquimé resists simple interpretation. The city appears to have undergone cycles of expansion and transformation, with certain sections rebuilt or modified over time. Some structures show signs of abrupt abandonment, while others suggest continued use and adaptation. By the time of Spanish contact in the 16th century, the site was no longer a thriving urban center, though its ruins were still visible and partially inhabited in surrounding regions. Mainstream archaeological interpretations often describe Paquimé as a regional center of trade, ritual, and cultural convergence. It is frequently associated with the broader Mogollon cultural tradition, though it also shows clear influence from Mesoamerican civilizations further south. In this sense, it is understood as a crossroads, a place where different worlds met, exchanged goods, ideas, and perhaps belief systems. But what exactly held this crossroads together? Some structures within Paquimé suggest more than purely domestic or economic function. Certain architectural alignments, ceremonial platforms, and enclosures raise questions about ritual activity embedded within the urban fabric. There are indications of ceremonial ball courts, plazas oriented in specific ways, and spaces that may have been used for gatherings whose purpose is not fully clear from material remains alone. One of the most intriguing aspects of the site is its apparent emphasis on symbolic architecture. Doorways and passageways are often arranged in sequences, guiding movement through controlled spatial transitions. Was this purely practical design, or did it reflect a deeper conceptual understanding of movement through space as a kind of ritual or narrative progression? Outside mainstream interpretations, some researchers and alternative theorists have suggested that Paquimé may represent a more complex cultural synthesis than currently understood. Ideas have been proposed that its architecture encodes astronomical knowledge, seasonal cycles, or cosmological beliefs embedded into its layout. Others have speculated whether its role as a trade hub also made it a center for ideological exchange, where symbolic systems from distant cultures merged into new forms of expression. There are even quieter questions that arise from its sudden decline. Why did a city so deeply integrated into regional networks eventually fade from prominence? Was it due to environmental pressure, shifts in trade routes, internal social change, or a combination of multiple forces acting over time? The archaeological record suggests transformation rather than a single catastrophic event, but the details remain incomplete. Standing among the ruins today, one encounters not grandeur in the traditional monumental sense, but something more subtle. The imprint of a society that organized itself in harmony with a challenging environment, yet left behind a structure whose meaning is still partially obscured. The walls, though eroded, still outline rooms that once held daily life, ceremony, and exchange. The silence is not empty. It is layered. Even now, as research continues and excavations refine our understanding, Paquimé does not resolve into a single narrative. It remains a place of convergence not only in geography, but in interpretation, a site where different explanations overlap without fully displacing one another. What kind of worldview shaped a city that blended earth architecture, water engineering, trade networks, and symbolic design into a single living system? And if so much of its structure is visible, why does its underlying meaning still feel just out of reach, as though part of its story remains embedded not only in the ruins, but in the questions they continue to raise beneath the desert sky? As the trail of mystery continues across the dry corridors of ancient North America, the narrative turns southward, toward a place where desert silence seems to hold on to something that time itself has struggled to erase. In the northern reaches of present-day Mexico, within the vast expanse of Chihuahua's high desert, lies the archaeological site known as Paquimé, also called Casas Grandes. From above, it appears almost understated, a low spread of earthen forms blending into the pale earth. But on the ground, the remains reveal something far more deliberate. Sun-baked adobe walls rise in fractured outlines, forming the skeleton of a once complex urban center. The wind moves through empty rooms that once held life, sound, and ceremony. Here, in a landscape that feels harsh and unforgiving, a sophisticated society once built something remarkable. Paquimé is believed to have flourished between roughly 1200 and 1450 BC. It became one of the most important cultural centers of the region, often associated with what archaeologists call the Casas Grandes culture. Unlike isolated desert settlements, Paquimé was deeply connected to a wider network stretching across what is now the southwestern United States and northern Mexico. Trade routes carried turquoise, marine shells, pottery, and exotic materials across vast distances. In return, ideas, rituals, and architectural influences flowed back into this desert hub. But what stands out immediately is not just its connections, it is its design. The settlement was carefully planned, with multi-story adobe complexes, organized plazas, and a water management system that redirected seasonal flows into usable channels. Even in an arid environment where survival required constant adaptation, Paquimé seems to reflect intention rather than improvisation. Narrow corridors lead into larger ceremonial spaces. Elevated platforms suggest areas of gathering or authority, and scattered throughout the site are structures whose purpose still invites debate. Among the most striking architectural features are the so-called T-shaped doorways. Narrow at the base and widening at the top, they appear repeatedly across the ruins, carved into thick adobe walls. Their function is still not fully understood. Were they purely practical, designed for structural stability in an earthquake-prone region? Or did they carry symbolic meaning, perhaps representing passage, transformation, or identity within a structured social order? Their consistent presence suggests importance beyond convenience, yet no single explanation has fully settled the question. Then there are the macaw breeding pens. Inside certain enclosures, archaeologists discovered evidence that scarlet macaws were raised far from their natural tropical habitat. These birds, with their vivid red and gold feathers, were not native to the desert. They were brought here, likely through long-distance trade, and carefully maintained within specialized structures. The effort required to sustain such animals in this environment was considerable. Why were they so valuable? In many Mesoamerican cultures, macaws were associated with the sun, fire, and elite ritual symbolism. But in Paquimé, their exact role remains partially obscured by time. As excavations continued, another layer of complexity emerged, evidence of social organization that suggests both hierarchy and specialization. Some areas appear residential, others ceremonial, and still others industrial, where pottery production and craftwork took place. The scale of coordination implies leadership, planning, and a shared cultural framework that extended beyond a simple village system. Yet, despite these insights, one central question persists. What happened here? By the time Spanish explorers reached the broader region in the 16th century, Paquimé had already been abandoned for over a century. There were no inhabitants to explain the collapse, no written records left behind. Only the ruins remained, slowly returning to the desert. Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest a combination of environmental stress, resource depletion, and shifting trade networks. Extended droughts may have strained agricultural systems. Trade routes may have shifted, weakening Paquimé's economic and cultural connections. Internal social changes could have gradually led to dispersal rather than sudden catastrophe. But the absence of a clear ending has allowed other interpretations to surface as well. Some researchers and local traditions have speculated about broader regional upheavals, periods of instability that might have disrupted multiple interconnected settlements at once. Others have pointed to the possibility of ideological transformation, where the population did not vanish, but rather migrated, carrying their cultural practices elsewhere, leaving Paquimé as a ceremonial site slowly emptied of its original purpose. More speculative perspectives go further. The precision of the site's layout, the alignment of certain structures, and the symbolic repetition of architectural forms have led some to suggest astronomical or cosmological planning embedded within the city itself. Could Paquimé have been designed not only as a settlement, but as a reflection of celestial order, its spaces mapped onto patterns of the sky? While no consensus supports this view, the question continues to appear in discussions of its design logic. There are also fringe interpretations that imagine Paquimé as a rediscovered remnant of a far older, now lost cultural wave that once extended across the continent, later fragmented by time and migration. These ideas remain outside mainstream archaeology, yet they persist in popular imagination, fueled by the site's striking architecture and incomplete narrative. What remains undeniable is that Paquimé resists simple explanation. It is neither fully familiar nor entirely alien. It sits in that uneasy space between what is known and what is still being assembled piece by piece through excavation and interpretation. Standing among its ruins today, one might notice how the desert does not rush to reveal its secrets. Wind erodes the edges of walls slowly, almost patiently. Shadows shift across rooms where no voices remain, and the silence feels less like emptiness and more like something paused mid-story. So the question lingers, as it often does in places like this. Was Paquimé's disappearance the result of gradual abandonment? Or does the landscape still conceal aspects of its ending that have yet to be uncovered beneath the dust and adobe fragments? As the story moves away from the sun-scorched remains of Paquimé, the focus shifts across continents and across time, toward another landscape where human memory seems to have been carved directly into stone. A place where abandonment does not feel like an event, but like something that unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if the land itself was quietly reclaiming what once belonged to it. In central Anatolia, within the surreal terrain of Cappadocia, the earth rises and folds into soft volcanic ridges known as fairy chimneys. From a distance, they look almost unreal, towers shaped by wind and water over thousands of years, their pale surfaces glowing under the shifting light. But as one approaches, the illusion of emptiness dissolves. The rock is not empty at all. It is hollowed, carved, inhabited by absence and memory. Among these formations lies Çavuşin village ruins, a site where human presence and geological formation seem inseparable. Unlike traditional villages built upon the land, this settlement was built within it. Entire homes, stairways, and communal spaces were carved directly into the soft volcanic tuff, creating a layered environment where architecture is indistinguishable from geology. At first glance, what remains appears fragmented: collapsed facades, broken cave openings, and weathered stone fronts exposed to centuries of erosion. Yet beneath this apparent disintegration lies a deeper continuity. This was once a thriving settlement, inhabited across Byzantine and early Christian periods, its residents adapting to a landscape that demanded ingenuity rather than resistance. One of the most striking remnants is the Church of St. John the Baptist, partially carved into the cliff face. Its scale suggests importance, not only as a place of worship, but as a communal anchor within the village. Inside, faint traces of frescoes still cling to the walls, figures softened by time, their outlines blurred as though they are slowly dissolving back into the stone that holds them. What did these images once mean to those who gathered here in silence, surrounded by rock and shadow? Life in Çavuşin was shaped by both protection and vulnerability. The soft volcanic rock allowed entire multi-level dwellings to be carved into the cliffs, offering insulation from extreme temperatures and concealment from external threats. Narrow passages connected rooms that were stacked vertically within the hillside, forming a dense and hidden network of habitation. From the outside, the village may have appeared modest. Inside, it was anything but simple. And yet, the very material that made this life possible also carried within it the seeds of instability. Over time, erosion and structural collapse became an unavoidable reality. Sections of the cliff face began to break away. Entire clusters of homes were abandoned, not because they were no longer needed, but because the ground itself was no longer reliable. By the mid-20th century, significant portions of the village were declared unsafe, leading to the gradual relocation of its inhabitants to more stable ground nearby. But abandonment, in a place like this, is never fully complete. Walking through the ruins today, one encounters spaces that still feel inhabited in a strange, indirect way. Doorways open into rooms where light falls at unnatural angles. Staircases lead nowhere, ending abruptly in fractured stone. Chimneys rise from homes that no longer exist in full. It raises a quiet question: when does a place truly stop being lived in? Archaeological interpretations explain Çavuşin as part of a broader network of early Christian and Byzantine cave settlements across Cappadocia. These communities are known for their resilience, particularly during periods of regional instability, when concealment and adaptability were essential for survival. Nearby regions, such as Grande, reveal similar patterns: entire underground complexes and rock-cut sanctuaries designed to protect both people and belief systems. Yet even within this well-documented history, certain aspects remain open to interpretation. The sheer scale of excavation across Cappadocia suggests long-term, coordinated effort spanning generations. Who first envisioned transforming an entire volcanic landscape into inhabitable architecture? Was it a gradual evolution driven purely by necessity, or did it follow earlier traditions that have since been lost? Some theories propose that the rock-cut landscapes of Cappadocia may have origins extending further back than the commonly accepted Byzantine period, potentially influenced by earlier Anatolian cultures. While evidence for continuous development exists, gaps in the archaeological record leave room for questions about how knowledge of subterranean construction was transmitted across centuries. More speculative interpretations push further still. The complexity of underground cities in the region has led some to imagine a forgotten continuity of advanced planning, communities that may have understood the geological structure of the region in ways that allowed them to create vast hidden networks beneath the surface. Others have suggested symbolic or ritual dimensions to this underground existence, where descent into the earth was not only practical, but also spiritual, a movement away from the surface world into something deeper, more protected, and perhaps more sacred. In Çavuşin itself, these ideas find no direct confirmation, yet the atmosphere of the ruins often invites reflection beyond what is immediately visible. The carved spaces feel intentional in ways that are still not fully mapped. Certain chambers seem too precisely shaped to be purely functional. Others appear positioned with an awareness of light, shadow, and elevation that raises quiet questions about their original purpose. And then there is the silence. Not an empty silence, but one that feels layered, as if it has accumulated over centuries. Wind passes through broken windows carved into stone. Dust shifts across thresholds where footsteps once echoed. The village does not feel entirely erased. It feels paused, suspended in a state between presence and absence. Perhaps that is what makes Çavuşin so compelling within the broader landscape of ancient mysteries. It does not offer a clear ending. Instead, it offers a transformation, life absorbed into rock, community dissolved into terrain, history folded into geology. So as the narrative continues through these carved landscapes of Anatolia, one question remains quietly unresolved. Was Çavuşin simply abandoned due to natural decay and human relocation, or does the village still hold deeper layers of intention and memory hidden within its fractured stone, waiting for something or someone to fully understand what was once built beneath the surface of this living rock? From the carved cliffs of Çavuşin, where entire villages are shaped within volcanic stone, the journey moves deeper into Anatolia's ancient interior. The rock-hewn silence gives way once again to open plains, where the landscape flattens, and time seems to spread itself more evenly across the horizon. Here, beneath layers of soil and centuries of forgotten settlement, lies one of the earliest known chapters of human transformation, from wandering life to structured community. In southeastern Anatolia, near the modern Tigris Basin, stands the archaeological mound known as Çayönü. Unlike stone monuments or carved cave settlements, Çayönü exists primarily as a tell, a low rise formed by thousands of years of human occupation, rebuilding, and gradual accumulation. To the untrained eye, it appears as a quiet hill in a wide valley. But beneath its surface lies a sequence of human decisions stretching back nearly 10 millennia. Excavations at Çayönü have revealed one of the most important early Neolithic settlements in the Near East. Dating from approximately 10,000 BC to 6,000 BC, the site represents a transitional world where humans were shifting from mobile hunter-gatherer groups into more permanent, structured communities. It is not a city in the later sense, but it is also no longer a temporary camp. It exists in a threshold space, between movement and settlement, between instinct and design. What makes Çayönü particularly compelling is the diversity of its architectural phases. Over time, different building styles emerge within the archaeological layers, as if the settlement itself were experimenting with how human life could be organized. Early structures are simple, circular or oval in shape, constructed from stone foundations and organic materials. Later phases introduce rectilinear buildings, suggesting a shift toward more planned spatial organization. At the heart of the site lies a feature that continues to draw attention, the so-called grill plan buildings. These structures consist of parallel stone walls forming narrow compartments beneath raised floors. Their exact function remains debated. Some interpretations suggest storage, possibly for grain or other resources. Others propose they may have been used for ventilation or even early forms of animal husbandry. Yet no single explanation fully captures their design logic. Nearby, archaeologists have uncovered what is often referred to as the skull building, a structure containing human skulls carefully arranged in a deliberate manner. This discovery has led to interpretations involving ritual practices, ancestor veneration, or early forms of collective memory tied to the dead. But the precise meaning behind these arrangements remains uncertain. Why were these skulls collected, curated, and placed within a specific architectural space? What role did the dead play in the identity of the living community? Other areas of Çayönü reveal evidence of early metallurgy experimentation, including some of the earliest known instances of copper processing in the region. Stone tools, bone implements, and figurines further illustrate a society engaged in both practical survival and symbolic expression. There is a sense that material culture here is not yet specialized into rigid categories. It is fluid, overlapping, and still forming its own definitions. And yet, despite this clarity of archaeological detail, Çayönü resists simple interpretation. The settlement appears to have undergone repeated cycles of architectural transformation. Buildings are constructed, modified, abandoned, and replaced. Floors are resurfaced, walls rebuilt, and spatial organization reconfigured over generations. This creates a layered record not of a single society, but of many overlapping phases of human experimentation with settlement itself. Mainstream archaeology interprets Çayönü as a key site in the Neolithic transition, a place where early agricultural practices began to take shape alongside domestication of animals and more permanent habitation. It is often seen as part of the broader Fertile Crescent development, where early human communities began to reshape their relationship with environment, food production, and social structure. But even within this framework, deeper questions remain open. What exactly prompted the shift from circular to rectangular architecture? Was it purely functional efficiency, or did it reflect a change in how people conceptualized space, ownership, or community identity? Why do certain buildings appear to hold ritual significance, while others remain strictly utilitarian? And how were decisions about construction and reconstruction made in a society that was still defining its own social structures? Some alternative interpretations, often explored outside mainstream academic discourse, suggest that early Neolithic sites like Çayönü preserve traces of cognitive or symbolic transitions that are not fully visible in material remains alone. The sudden emergence of structured architecture, ritualized burial practices, and symbolic artifacts has led some to speculate about broader shifts in human consciousness, changes in how time, space, and mortality were understood. Others propose that Çayönü reflects a period of cultural convergence, where multiple groups with different traditions came together, blending practices in ways that produced architectural and ritual complexity. In this view, the site is not the invention of a single lineage, but a living negotiation of identities over centuries. Even within scientific archaeology, there is acknowledgement that Çayönü occupies a crucial but not fully resolved position in human history. It is one of the earliest known places where architecture, agriculture, ritual practice, and social organization begin to intertwine in a sustained and visible way. Yet the motivations behind these changes remain partially obscured by time. Walking through the excavated remains today, one encounters foundations that once supported daily life in its earliest structured forms. Hearths, storage areas, and communal spaces appear not as isolated features, but as parts of an evolving system. The impression is not of a finished civilization, but of one still in the process of becoming. And perhaps that is what gives Çayönü its quiet power. It does not present a fully formed answer about human origins, but rather a record of transformation in progress, an early experiment in what it means to live in place, together, over time. What kind of world were these early builders trying to create when they first began shaping stone into structured space? And as each layer of Çayönü continues to be uncovered, revealing more questions than conclusions, one final uncertainty remains. How much of the earliest human story is still hidden beneath the ground, waiting to redefine what we believe about the beginning of settled life itself. From the earliest layers of human settlement at Çayönü, where the first organized communities began shaping space, ritual, and survival into something lasting, the narrative moves once more, this time across continents and climates. The warm inland valleys of Anatolia fade into memory, replaced by salt wind, cold ocean air, and the stark edge of the northern seas. On the southern tip of the Shetland archipelago, where land meets the Atlantic in a constant dialogue of wind and water, lies Jarlshof. At first glance, the site appears almost indistinguishable from the rugged coastline that surrounds it. Stone walls emerge low and weathered from the earth, partially buried by centuries of sand, grass, and shifting sediment. But beneath this quiet surface lies one of the most layered archaeological sites in northern Europe, a place where human occupation stretches across thousands of years in continuous, overlapping phases. Unlike a single monument or settlement frozen in time, Jarlshof is a palimpsest of human presence. Each era has built upon the last, sometimes directly atop older structures, sometimes cutting into them, sometimes reusing them in ways that blur the distinction between past and present. The result is not a single story, but a sequence of worlds stacked upon one another. The earliest visible traces date back to the late Neolithic period, around 2500 BC, when simple structures suggest small farming communities adapting to a harsh and isolated environment. These early dwellings were modest, stone foundations supporting organic materials long since decayed. Yet even in their simplicity, they reveal something important: a determination to inhabit a landscape that offers little protection from wind, salt, and seasonal extremes. As time progresses through the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, the settlement expands and transforms. Circular houses, known as wheelhouses, appear, stone-built structures with radial divisions that create segmented living spaces. Their design is distinctive, almost architectural in its symbolism. Were these divisions purely functional, or did they reflect a deeper understanding of household organization, social structure, or even ritual separation within domestic life? The Iron Age phase of Jarlshof is particularly striking for its brochs, tower-like dry stone structures unique to northern Scotland. These massive constructions, with thick double walls and internal passages, suggest both defensive capability and communal significance. Their exact purpose remains debated. Were they fortifications, status symbols, or something more complex, multi-purpose structures that combined defense, residence, and social identity in a single architectural form? And yet, Jarlshof does not end there. With the arrival of the Norse period, the site enters a new phase of occupation. Viking settlers established farmsteads here, introducing longhouses that stretch in elongated forms across the landscape. These buildings reflect a different architectural philosophy, one centered on linear communal living, hearth-centered domesticity, and integration with agricultural activity. The Norse presence is not a brief interruption, but a sustained reconfiguration of the site's identity. The very name Jarlshof, meaning Earl's House, originates from later literary references, but it captures something of the layered significance the site held across time. Each cultural phase did not erase what came before. Instead, it absorbed, modified, or built over it. The ground itself became a record of continuity through transformation. Archaeologists working at Jarlshof have uncovered artifacts spanning millennia: pottery fragments, metal tools, weaving equipment, animal bones, and structural remains that collectively suggest a long history of adaptation to a challenging environment. The site is not defined by sudden collapse or singular event, but by endurance, by the quiet accumulation of human presence across shifting eras. Yet this very continuity raises questions that are not easily resolved. Why did successive cultures choose to inhabit the same location for such an extended period? Was it purely geographic advantage, A sheltered bay, access to resources, navigational significance? Or did the site hold a deeper, perhaps less tangible appeal that drew people back again and again across generations? Some interpretations suggest that Jarlshof represents more than practical settlement. The repeated reuse of space, the layering of structures, and the blending of architectural traditions have led some researchers to consider whether certain locations acquire long-term cultural or symbolic significance that persists beyond individual societies. In this view, the site becomes not just a place of habitation, but a focal point of inherited memory. There are also subtler questions embedded in its architecture. The overlapping of building phases sometimes creates spatial contradictions. Doorways that align with no clear purpose, walls that intersect older foundations in ways that suggest adaptation rather than planning. Were these simply practical responses to existing ruins, or did they reflect a continuity of knowledge passed between generations that is no longer fully visible in the archaeological record? Outside mainstream interpretation, some have speculated that sites like Jarlshof preserve echoes of earlier cultural perceptions of landscape continuity, where places were not seen as static, but as living environments shaped by ancestral presence. Others propose that the repeated occupation of such sites reflects a kind of unconscious geographical memory, where human settlement patterns are influenced not only by resources, but by inherited familiarity with place. Even within academic archaeology, there is recognition that Jarlshof challenges simple categorization. It is not a single culture, nor a single period, but a convergence of many. Each layer offers clarity and isolation, yet together they form a complex, interwoven narrative that resists linear explanation. Standing among the ruins today, one moves through time as much as space. A few steps can carry a visitor from Viking longhouse foundations to Iron Age Brock walls, and then further back into Neolithic traces barely visible beneath the soil. The sensation is not of traveling through history, but of history existing simultaneously in compressed form. The wind that moves across the site carries no distinction between these eras. It passes through Norse stone, Iron Age masonry, and Neolithic foundations alike, as if time itself has been flattened into a single continuous breath over the landscape. And so Jarlshof remains, neither fully preserved nor fully lost, but layered in a way that defies simple narrative closure. What does it mean when a single place holds so many different versions of human life, each built upon the remnants of the last? And as excavation continues to reveal still more beneath the surface, one question lingers in the shifting edge between stone and sea. How many histories are still waiting beneath Jarlshof, quietly stacked beneath what we have only just begun to uncover? Continuing from the earlier exploration of distant landscapes where oral tradition and archaeology intertwine, where memory itself seems to blur between what is known and what is merely preserved in story, we now turn toward the far north of Europe. Here, beyond the Atlantic's restless edge and the shifting narratives of the Americas, another kind of mystery waits beneath stone and earth. On the windswept archipelago of the Orkney Islands, the land flattens into open moor and sea-swept grass, where the horizon feels unusually close, as if the world itself has been pressed down by time. In this stark landscape stands one of prehistoric Britain's most enigmatic monuments, Maeshowe. At first glance, Maeshowe appears almost unassuming, a grassy mound rising gently from the earth, shaped by centuries of weather and silence. But beneath that mound lies a carefully engineered Neolithic chamber tomb, constructed around 2800 BC. Massive stone slabs form a central chamber, with precisely aligned passages leading inward, each block fitted with a deliberate, almost architectural patience that defies the idea of primitive construction. The entrance passage is narrow, low, and carefully angled. It forces anyone who enters to stoop, to slow down, to adjust to darkness. Was this simply practical engineering? Or was it meant to create a psychological threshold, a transition from the world of the living into something far more ambiguous? One of Maeshowe's most striking features reveals itself only at a specific moment in the year. During the winter solstice, when the sun sits at its lowest arc across the sky, its light penetrates directly through the entrance passage and illuminates the inner chamber. For a brief period, the stone interior, otherwise sealed in darkness, becomes filled with a golden beam of sunlight. This alignment suggests an intimate knowledge of celestial cycles, raising questions about the people who built it. Were they observers of the heavens, marking time not with written calendars, but with stone and shadow? Archaeology offers one explanation. Maeshowe was likely a communal tomb, part of a broader Neolithic tradition of honoring the dead through monumental architecture. Human remains were probably placed within, though much has been disturbed over millennia. The structure belongs to a wider ceremonial landscape on Orkney, where other ancient sites reflect a culture deeply engaged with ritual, ancestry, and the movement of the sun. Yet Maeshowe does not remain confined to the Neolithic world. More than 4,000 years after its construction, the chamber was entered again, not by its original builders, but by Norse travelers during the Viking Age. Around the 12th century A.D., a group of Norsemen forced their way inside, taking shelter from a storm, or perhaps seeking refuge during travel across the islands. What they left behind is one of the most unusual collections of inscriptions in northern Europe. Carved into the stone walls are runes, messages etched in Old Norse. Some are straightforward declarations of presence like, "This was carved by," followed by names now lost to time. Others are more cryptic, almost poetic in tone. One inscription claims that treasure was hidden within the mound. Another speaks of a woman who once visited, or perhaps a tale told among travelers by firelight. And then there are the references to a great beast or a legendary serpent, interpretations of which remain debated. Were these simply Viking-era jokes, exaggerations meant to amuse companions during a long night underground? Or do they hint at folklore older than the Norse themselves, stories absorbed into the stone like echoes from earlier inhabitants? The chamber becomes, in this sense, a layered archive. Neolithic builders shaped it for reasons we can partially reconstruct. Vikings added their voices centuries later, not realizing, or perhaps fully realizing, that they were entering a place already ancient beyond their own mythic horizon. But even archaeology has its limits here. The precise purpose of Maeshowe still invites discussion. Was it purely a burial chamber, or did it serve as a ceremonial observatory, where the cycles of the sun were not just recorded, but experienced as part of ritual life? Some researchers suggest that its alignment with the solstice may indicate a symbolic rebirth, where light returning to the chamber represents life emerging from death. More speculative interpretations go further. A few fringe theories propose that such monuments were part of a lost, widespread system of astronomical knowledge, shared across prehistoric Europe and possibly beyond. Others suggest that Maeshowe could have functioned as a kind of initiation space, where controlled exposure to darkness and light created altered states of perception, an ancient technology of consciousness shaped entirely from stone and timing. There are even those who wonder whether the chamber's precise geometry and acoustic properties were designed not only for sight, but for sound. A whisper inside Maeshowe can carry in unexpected ways, bouncing softly off stone surfaces. Could spoken words have held ritual significance here, amplified in the dark so that voice itself became part of the architecture? Yet none of these possibilities can be fully proven. The builders left no written explanation, only the enduring silence of their design. Standing at the threshold today, one is confronted by a strange sense of continuity. The passage still narrows the body. The chamber still gathers darkness. And once a year, the same sunlight still enters, as it did thousands of years ago. indifferent to the passage of human interpretation. What did that moment of illumination mean to those who first witnessed it? Was it a signal of renewal, a marker of time, or something more personal, an experience of connection between earth and sky that required no explanation at all? And as modern visitors step back out into the cold air of Orkney, leaving the stone chamber behind in silence once more, the question remains unresolved. Was Maeshowe built simply to house the dead, or to reveal something about the living that we have not yet fully understood? From the solstice-lit stone chamber of Maeshowe in the far north, where sunlight briefly touches ancient walls like a memory returning after long absence, the search for meaning shifts once again. The narrative of buried chambers and encoded skies does not end in the Atlantic winds of Orkney. It continues, quietly, steadily, across continents and into the high, rugged heart of Anatolia. Here, the landscape changes its language. On the Anatolian plateau in modern-day Turkey, near the small town of Boğazkale, the earth rises into rolling hills of dry grass and stone. In summer, the air shimmers with heat. In winter, it hardens under frost and wind. Among these hills lies the ruins of Hattusa, once the capital of the Hittite Empire, a powerful Bronze Age civilization that flourished around 1600 to 1200 BC. At first, Hattusa does not announce itself with grandeur. Much of it is fragmented. Collapsed walls, scattered foundations, and massive stone blocks resting where they fell thousands of years ago. Yet, as the ground is traced carefully, a city begins to reassemble itself in the imagination. Gateways, temples, fortified walls, and administrative quarters that once formed the heart of an empire. The scale of the city is striking. Massive defensive walls stretch for kilometers, built from stone foundations topped with mud brick superstructures. These were not simple barriers. They were engineered statements of power, designed to control movement and project authority across a vast and often unstable landscape. Within those walls, the city once held royal archives, temples dedicated to powerful deities, and spaces where political and religious authority merged into a single system. But what remains today is not only what was built, it is what was left behind. At Hattusa, archaeologists uncovered tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, pressed into clay and baked by time and fire. These texts reveal treaties, prayers, legal codes, and diplomatic correspondence between kings. Through them, a world of political complexity emerges. Alliances formed and broken, wars declared and ended, rituals performed to maintain balance between human authority and divine will. And yet, despite this wealth of written record, something feels incomplete. Certain aspects of Hattusa's layout still provoke quiet questions. The city's gates, for example, are not merely functional. The Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate are carved with imposing figures that seem to guard passage into the city. Were they purely symbolic, meant to intimidate enemies and protect sacred space? Or did they also reflect a deeper belief that boundaries between worlds, between human and divine, known and unknown, needed guardianship? Moving through the ruins, one encounters the great temple complex, believed to be dedicated to the storm god and the sun goddess. Its foundation suggests a carefully organized ritual space, where offerings, ceremonies, and administrative control were tightly interwoven. Religion here was not separate from governance. It was part of the machinery of the state itself. But even within this structured understanding, gaps remain. Some tablets reference rituals and ceremonies whose full meanings are no longer understood. The language of invocation is preserved, but the emotional and experiential context is lost. What did these rituals feel like to those who performed them? Were they acts of devotion, political necessity, or something in between? And then there are the underground passages and tunnels found beneath parts of the city. Some are narrow, carefully constructed, and extend in directions that do not always align with surface architecture. Archaeologists have suggested defensive or logistical purposes, hidden routes for movement during siege, or controlled access between sectors of the city. Yet their precise function is still debated. It is here that interpretation begins to widen. Some researchers propose that Hattusa's urban design reflects a highly symbolic cosmology, where the city itself was conceived as a reflection of cosmic order. In this view, gates, temples, and pathways were not only practical structures, but also representations of divine geography, mapping the heavens onto the earth. More speculative theories go further, suggesting that certain architectural alignments may have been intentionally designed to track celestial events or seasonal cycles, integrating astronomical observation into civic planning. While some alignments can be explained through practical orientation or terrain constraints, others continue to invite curiosity rather than certainty. There are also voices that interpret the Hittite religious system as preserving fragments of older, pre-urban traditions, beliefs carried forward and adapted rather than fully created within the Bronze Age state. In this reading, Hattusa becomes not just a capital of its own time, but a repository of inherited memory, where older mythic structures were absorbed into imperial religion. And yet, none of these interpretations fully resolves the sense of depth that lingers in the ruins. Walking through the remains of Hattusa today, one notices how silence behaves differently here compared to other ancient sites. It is not empty silence, but layered, like overlapping voices that have faded but not disappeared entirely. The wind moving through broken gateways produces soft echoes that feel almost deliberate, as though the city is still speaking in fragments. What then was Hattusa in its fullest sense? Was it simply a political capital, a seat of power that rose and fell like many others in antiquity? Or was it something more intricate, a place where governance, ritual, astronomy, and memory were woven together into a single civic identity? Even the destruction of the city around 1200 BC, part of the wider Bronze Age collapse, adds another layer of uncertainty. Whether through invasion, internal instability, environmental stress, or a combination of forces, the city was abandoned. Yet abandonment does not always mean disappearance. Civilizations often leave behind echoes that outlast their physical presence. And so the question remains suspended in the dry Anatolian air. If Hattusa was both a city and a symbol, both a political center and a ritual landscape, how much of its meaning can truly be recovered from stone and clay alone? And how much perhaps still waits beneath the surface, unread, unexcavated, or simply no longer understandable in the language of the present? From the carved highlands of Hattusa, where empires once shaped the landscape into a language of stone and authority, the journey turns once again toward the edge of a different kind of world, one defined not by continental interiors or imperial capitals, but by cliffs, tides, and the relentless pressure of the Atlantic Ocean. The sense of civilization shifts here, from inland command centers to coastal thresholds where land and sea continuously negotiate their boundaries. On the rugged northern coast of Cornwall, where cliffs rise abruptly above crashing waves and wind shapes every exposed surface, stands the site known as Tintagel Castle. Today, its ruins appear fragmented and weather-worn, a series of stone walls and arching remains scattered across a dramatic headland and its adjacent island-like promontory. A modern bridge connects the two, but the landscape itself feels divided by something older than engineering, something geological, historical, and perhaps narrative in nature. At first encounter, Tintagel seems like a medieval fortress shaped by strategic necessity. The remains of curtain walls, halls, and domestic structures suggest a stronghold built into a naturally defensible landscape. Historical evidence places much of its major construction in the post-Roman period, particularly between the 5th and 7th centuries AD, a time when political structures in Britain were fragmented and regional power centers emerged in shifting configurations. It is during this early medieval phase that Tintagel becomes particularly significant. Archaeological excavations have uncovered a surprising concentration of high-status imported goods at the site. Fine Mediterranean pottery, glassware, and amphora fragments originating from regions as distant as the eastern Mediterranean. These findings suggest that Tintagel was not an isolated coastal outpost, but part of a broader network of trade that connected post-Roman Britain to far-reaching maritime routes. This evidence challenges older assumptions about the so-called Dark Ages as a period of complete isolation. Instead, Tintagel appears as a place of exchange, where goods, ideas, and possibly diplomatic relationships moved across seas that are often imagined as barriers, but functioned instead as highways. And yet, the story of Tintagel is not defined by trade alone. The site occupies a unique place in cultural memory due to its association with later medieval legend, particularly narratives surrounding figures such as Arthurian tradition. While historical archaeology does not confirm the existence of such figures, the persistence of these stories reveals something important about how landscapes become layered with meaning over time. Tintagel becomes not just a settlement, but a narrative site, a place where history and legend begin to overlap. This overlap raises deeper questions. Why does this particular location become so strongly embedded in later storytelling traditions? Was it its dramatic geography, its visible ruins, or the memory of past significance preserved through oral tradition? Or did the site itself, once a center of power and exchange, leave behind a cultural imprint that invited reinterpretation by later generations? The physical remains of Tintagel add further complexity. On the island headland, archaeological work has revealed the outlines of substantial buildings, including what appears to be a large hall structure. The scale of construction suggests elite occupation, possibly associated with regional rulers or high-status administrative figures. Yet the precise nature of its political function remains uncertain. Was this a royal stronghold, a trading hub, a ceremonial site, or some combination of all three? The mainland settlement, connected by the narrow neck of land and modern bridge, reveals additional layers of occupation. Terraced structures and smaller buildings indicate sustained habitation and activity. Together, the island and mainland form a single integrated site that spans both defensive positioning and practical settlement. One of the most intriguing aspects of Tintagel is the sheer volume of imported materials found there, particularly for such a geographically remote location in early medieval terms. Amphora fragments suggest the movement of wine and olive oil from Mediterranean regions, while fine ceramics point to elite consumption patterns far beyond local production capabilities. How did such goods reach this remote corner of the British coast during a period often characterized by political fragmentation? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that Tintagel functioned as a high-status seat of power, possibly associated with regional kingship in early medieval Cornwall. Its location would have allowed control over maritime routes along the Atlantic seaboard, making it a strategic node in long-distance trade networks. The concentration of luxury imports supports the idea of an elite presence capable of engaging in wide-ranging exchange systems. But even within this framework, uncertainties remain. The scale of imported goods is unusual for a site of its size and location. Some researchers have suggested that Tintagel may have functioned less as a permanent royal residence and more as a periodic assembly site, a place where elites gathered seasonally or for specific events tied to trade, diplomacy, or ritualized exchange. If so, its significance would lie not in continuous occupation, but in episodic intensity. Other interpretations explore the symbolic dimension of its geography. The separation of the headland by tidal waters creates a natural sense of liminality. At high tide, the island becomes partially isolated. At low tide, it reconnects to the mainland. This shifting accessibility may have contributed to perceptions of the site as a threshold space, neither fully isolated nor fully connected. Could this natural rhythm have influenced how the site was understood or used? Outside mainstream archaeology, more speculative ideas occasionally emerge regarding Tintagel's role in broader cultural memory. Some suggest that its enduring association with legend reflects a deeper continuity between physical place and narrative identity. In this view, Tintagel is not simply a historical site later mythologized, but a location whose early prominence naturally invited mythic interpretation as its original context faded. There are also questions about what remains undiscovered. Coastal erosion continues to reshape the headland, meaning that portions of the site may already have been lost to the sea. What structures once stood on cliffs now eroded away? What evidence of occupation, trade, or ceremony has already disappeared beneath the waves? Even today, as archaeological investigation continues, Tintagel resists a singular definition. It is at once a settlement, a trade hub, a political center, and a landscape embedded in centuries of storytelling. Its identity shifts depending on the lens through which it is viewed: historical, archaeological, or cultural. Standing among its ruins today, with the Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond the cliffs, one is left with a sense of layered presence rather than resolution. Stone walls frame empty space. Wind moves through fractured structures. The sea continues its slow reshaping of the coastline, as it has done for millennia. And so Tintagel remains suspended between history and narrative, between what can be excavated and what can only be interpreted. What kind of place becomes powerful enough to exist simultaneously in archaeological record and cultural memory? And as the waves continue to strike the base of the cliffs, one question lingers in the shifting boundary between land and sea. How much of Tintagel's true story has already been lost to the ocean, and how much still waits beneath the tides, just out of reach of understanding? From the storm-lashed cliffs of Tintagel, where stone and sea merge into legend and erosion slowly rewrites history, the journey turns once more inward, away from the Atlantic edge and across vast stretches of land, toward an environment shaped not by ocean winds or northern cold, but by heat, dust, and the silence of arid plains. The narrative shifts from coastal fortresses and medieval echoes into a far older world, where civilization itself was still taking form along the fragile edges of river systems and desert boundaries. In the southeastern reaches of Iran, along the dried corridors of the Helmand River basin, lies the ancient site of Shahr-e Sukhteh, a name that translates as the Burnt City. From above, it appears as a vast, low mound rising from the surrounding desert, its contours shaped by millennia of wind and abandonment. There are no towering monuments here, no surviving walls that dominate the horizon. Instead, the site reveals itself gradually, layer by layer, as excavation peels back time itself. Shahr-e Sukhteh was founded around 3200 BC and flourished for more than a millennium, reaching its peak during the Bronze Age before eventually being abandoned. It was once a thriving urban center, part of the broader network of early civilizations that developed across Iran, Central Asia, and the Indus Valley. Archaeological evidence suggests a highly organized society engaged in craft production, trade, and complex urban planning, despite the harsh and unpredictable environment in which it existed. The city's remains tell a story of adaptation. Houses were built from mud brick, arranged along planned streets that suggest a degree of urban coordination uncommon for its time. Workshops reveal specialized production, textiles, pottery, and intricate artifacts that indicate both technical skill and aesthetic awareness. Evidence of trade connects Shahr-e Sukhteh to distant regions, including the Indus Valley civilization and areas of Central Asia, suggesting that this was not an isolated settlement, but part of a wider network of exchange. Yet what makes Shahr-e Sukhteh particularly compelling is not only its scale or sophistication, but the unusual nature of some of its discoveries. Among the most discussed finds is a female burial containing what is often referred to as an early artificial eye. Crafted from bitumen paste and gold threads, the object appears to have been designed to fit into an eye socket, suggesting a form of prosthetic adaptation. Whether it was functional, symbolic, or ritualistic remains a subject of debate. Was this an attempt to restore appearance, a marker of status, or part of a funerary tradition whose meaning is no longer fully understood? Other burials at the site reveal similarly complex social patterns. Some graves contain individuals interred with care and richness of objects, while others are comparatively modest. This variation suggests social differentiation, but the precise structure of that society, its hierarchy, governance, and belief systems, remains only partially reconstructed. Even more intriguing are the signs of advanced administrative behavior. Seals and standardized markings found at the site indicate systems of identification or control, possibly related to trade or resource distribution. These artifacts suggest that Shahr-e Sukhteh was not only economically active, but administratively structured, with mechanisms in place for organizing goods and possibly people across an expanding urban environment. And yet, despite this complexity, the city eventually declined and was abandoned. The reasons for its disappearance are still debated. Environmental change is often cited as a primary factor. The shifting course of the river, combined with increasing aridity, may have gradually undermined the agricultural and economic foundations of the settlement. As water sources diminished, sustaining such a large urban population would have become increasingly difficult. But environmental explanations alone do not fully capture the sense of abrupt transition observed in certain layers of the site. Some areas show signs of sudden abandonment, while others suggest gradual decline. This uneven pattern raises questions about whether additional factors, social, political, or external, may have contributed to the city's end. Mainstream archaeology views Shahr-e Sukhteh as a key example of early urban development in eastern Iran, representing a sophisticated Bronze Age society that participated in long-distance exchange networks. Its material culture reflects a blend of local innovation and external influence, indicating a dynamic and interconnected ancient world. However, even within this framework, many aspects remain unresolved. The purpose and meaning of certain artifacts continue to provoke discussion. The symbolic significance of burial practices, the role of specialized objects, and the exact nature of the city's administrative systems are still being refined through ongoing research. The further excavation proceeds, the more complex the picture becomes. Outside strictly academic interpretations, some observers have suggested that sites like Shahr-e Sukhteh may preserve evidence of cultural experimentation that does not fit neatly into later historical categories. The combination of technological skill, symbolic objects, and early administrative systems has led to broader reflections on how early urban societies understood identity, mortality, and social structure. These ideas remain speculative, but they highlight the interpretive gaps that still exist. There is also the broader question of why such a sophisticated urban center developed in a region often perceived as marginal in later historical narratives. Shahr-e Sukhteh challenges simplified geographic assumptions about where civilization began or concentrated. Instead, it points to a more distributed and interconnected ancient world, where multiple regions developed complex societies in parallel, often influencing one another in ways still not fully understood. Walking through the excavated remains today, what remains is not grandeur in the monumental sense, but density, layers of habitation compressed into earth and dust. Foundations of homes, fragments of tools, traces of fire, and the faint outlines of streets all suggest a city once alive with movement, production, and exchange. And yet, the silence now is complete. The burnt city is not merely a ruin, it is a record of disappearance, a place where human effort accumulated for centuries, only to be gradually absorbed back into the landscape. Even its name suggests transformation through destruction, though whether fire, abandonment, or something more complex defined its end is still not fully clear. What kind of society builds a city capable of sustained urban life in such a harsh environment, develops intricate systems of trade and administration, and then vanishes, leaving only fragmented traces behind? And as archaeologists continue to uncover new layers of Shahr-e Sukhteh, one question remains suspended in the dry air above the desert soil. How much of this ancient city's story is still buried beneath the sands, waiting to reshape everything we think we know about the early world? From the sun-scorched silence of Shahr-e Sukhteh, where entire cities once rose and faded beneath the shifting breath of desert winds, the narrative moves across continents once more. The dry basins of ancient Iran give way to an equally harsh but distinctly different landscape, one shaped not by river valleys or shifting waterways, but by the vast, open deserts of North America, where distance itself feels like a defining feature of the land. In the Gila River Valley of present-day Arizona, rising quietly from the arid soil, stands the weathered earthen monument known as Casa Grande Ruins. At first glance, it appears almost out of place, an isolated structure of packed earth, its muted tones blending into the desert horizon. There are no surrounding walls of a vast city, no visible streets or dense urban fabric. Instead, there is a single, imposing structure, a massive adobe building that has endured centuries of heat, wind, and seasonal flood. This structure, often referred to as the Great House, was built by the Hohokam culture, with construction dating roughly to the 13th and 14th centuries A.D. It rises in layered forms, its thick earthen walls still standing despite centuries of erosion. The structure is 4 stories tall, a remarkable architectural achievement for a society working with compacted earth rather than stone or timber in abundance. Its scale alone invites questions. Why build such a large structure in an open desert environment? What purpose did it serve in a landscape where survival depended on careful water management and seasonal adaptation? Archaeological evidence suggests that Casa Grande was part of a broader Hohokam settlement system, which included extensive canal networks stretching across the Salt and Gila River valleys. These irrigation systems are among the most sophisticated in ancient North America, channeling river water across long distances to support agriculture in an otherwise arid region. The Great House is believed to have functioned within this network, possibly as a ceremonial center, an administrative hub, or a structure tied to astronomical observation. One of the most intriguing aspects of Casa Grande is its alignment. The building's orientation and the placement of its openings suggest a possible relationship with solar events. Certain windows and apertures appear to align with the movement of the sun during solstices and equinoxes. Whether this was intentional or coincidental remains a subject of ongoing interpretation. Was this structure designed to track celestial cycles, or did its builders embed meaning into its form in ways that are no longer fully understood? Inside the structure, the remaining walls bear traces of plaster and faded markings, suggesting that the interior once held a more complex visual or functional environment than what survives today. The absence of extensive domestic artifacts within the structure itself has led many researchers to question whether it was ever used as a permanent residence. Instead, it may have served a specialized function, one that was periodic, ceremonial, or administrative in nature. Yet Casa Grande does not exist in isolation. It is part of a wider cultural landscape shaped by the Hohokam people, whose presence in the region extended for centuries before gradually declining around the 15th century A.D. Their canal systems, villages, and ceremonial spaces indicate a society deeply attuned to environmental cycles and resource management. But as with many ancient cultures in arid environments, questions remain about how and why such systems eventually cease to function at their original scale. Mainstream archaeological interpretations often point to environmental stress, shifting river patterns, prolonged droughts, or social reorganization as possible factors in the decline of Hohokam settlements. Changes in water availability would have had profound consequences for agricultural systems, potentially forcing populations to relocate or restructure their communities. But Casa Grande itself presents a different kind of question, one not fully answered by environmental explanation alone. Why was such a monumental structure preserved in a relatively isolated state, while surrounding settlements appear less prominently in the archaeological record? Was it part of a larger complex that has yet to be fully uncovered? Or did it serve as a central node within a dispersed network of communities whose traces remain partially hidden beneath the desert floor? Some interpretations suggest that Casa Grande may have functioned as a gathering point for dispersed groups, a place where seasonal events, trade, or ceremonial activities were concentrated. Its scale and construction would have made it visible from a great distance, possibly serving as a landmark in a landscape defined by vast open space and limited visual reference points. Other, more speculative perspectives explore the possibility that its architectural form encodes symbolic or cosmological knowledge. The precise layering of its construction, combined with its apparent celestial alignments, has led some to suggest that it may represent more than a functional building. In this view, the Great House becomes a kind of constructed interface between earth, sky, and human observation of time. While such interpretations remain outside mainstream academic consensus, they reflect an enduring fascination with how ancient societies encoded meaning into architecture, especially in environments where written records are absent and material structures carry the primary weight of communication. Even within established archaeology, however, Casa Grande continues to raise unresolved questions. The full extent of the surrounding Hohokam settlement system is still being investigated. New findings in the broader region continue to reshape understanding of how interconnected these communities may have been. The Great House, once thought to be an isolated anomaly, is now increasingly viewed as part of a more complex cultural and infrastructural landscape. Standing before the structure today, one is struck not by grandeur in the traditional sense, but by endurance. The earth itself has become both material and memory. Walls have softened at their edges, yet still hold form against time. The building does not dominate its environment. It merges with it, as though shaped by the same forces that shaped the desert around it. There is a quiet tension in its presence. It feels both familiar and distant, clearly human-made yet difficult to fully situate within a single narrative of use or meaning. It is a structure that resists closure, even after decades of study. What kind of society constructs a monumental earthen tower in an open desert, integrates it into an extensive irrigation network, and then leaves behind no definitive account of its purpose? And as the desert continues to shift around Casa Grande, slowly revealing and concealing its foundations, one question remains suspended in the dry air. How much of its original meaning is still preserved beneath the layers of earth, waiting for the next excavation to change what we think we understand? From the earthen tower of Casa Grande, where desert civilizations once shaped monumental silence into architecture, the journey moves once more across continents and into an entirely different kind of landscape. The wide, open deserts of North America begin to dissolve, replaced by the shifting geography of Central Asia, where sand, wind, and stone converge along ancient trade routes that once connected entire worlds. In the Turpan Basin of northwestern China, surrounded by harsh desert expanses and dramatic wind-carved terrain, lie the haunting remains of Jiaohe Ruins. Unlike most ancient cities, Jiaohe does not rise above the earth in constructed form. Instead, it is carved into a narrow plateau of compacted loess soil, shaped by river erosion into a natural island-like formation. From above, it appears as a long, bare spine of land, flanked by deep river valleys that once provided both protection and isolation. At first approach, the site feels less like a ruin and more like a memory etched directly into the earth. Streets, courtyards, residential quarters, and temples are not built upon the landscape. They are carved from it. Walls are not assembled from stone blocks or bricks, but excavated from the ground itself, leaving behind negative space as architecture. The result is a city defined not by construction, but by subtraction. Jiaohe's origins trace back over 2,000 years, flourishing particularly between the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty periods, roughly from around the 2nd century BC to the 9th century AD. It served as a strategic and administrative center along the Silk Road, the vast network of trade routes that connected China with Central Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. Merchants, monks, envoys, and travelers once passed through this valley city, bringing with them goods, beliefs, and ideas that shaped entire regions. The city's layout reflects a structured organization despite its unconventional construction. Wide streets run along the central axis, flanked by residential quarters carved into the earth. Temples occupy elevated positions, suggesting a separation between civic, commercial, and spiritual spaces. Storage areas, administrative buildings, and defensive positions all emerge from the same continuous mass of loess, as though the city was revealed rather than built. And yet, despite its clear organization, Jiaohe carries an unusual sense of impermanence. The material from which it is carved, loess soil, is both stable and fragile. It holds shape remarkably well in dry conditions, allowing for intricate excavation. But it is also highly vulnerable to erosion when exposed to water or prolonged weathering. This duality may help explain both the city's initial success and its eventual abandonment. Historical records suggest that Jiaohe declined around the 9th century AD, likely due to a combination of political shifts, environmental changes, and the gradual relocation of regional populations. As Silk Road routes shifted and regional powers changed, the city's strategic importance diminished. Without sustained maintenance, the exposed structures began to erode, slowly returning to the landscape from which they were carved. But even this explanation leaves deeper questions unresolved. Unlike many ancient cities that collapse into rubble, Jiaohe fades through erosion, as if dissolving rather than falling. Streets remain visible, but softened. Walls still stand, but rounded by wind and time. It is a city that does not appear destroyed in a single moment, but continuously undone over centuries. What does it mean for a city to disappear not through catastrophe, but through gradual return to earth? Mainstream archaeological interpretation views Jiaohe as a key example of Silk Road urban planning, adapted to environmental constraints. Its carved architecture reflects both ingenuity and necessity, allowing settlement in a region where traditional building materials were scarce. The city's layout demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of space, hierarchy, and function, integrated directly into the geological structure of the plateau. Yet even within this framework, certain aspects remain open to interpretation. The decision to carve an entire city into exposed earth rather than construct it from transported materials suggests more than practical adaptation. It reflects a different relationship between human activity and landscape, one where the boundary between natural and built environment becomes indistinct. Was this purely functional, or did it reflect a broader cultural or philosophical approach to inhabiting space? Some alternative interpretations suggest that carved cities like Jiaohe embody a deeper symbolic relationship with land itself. In this view, excavation is not simply construction in reverse, but an act of integration, embedding human presence directly into geological time. Others propose that such cities reflect a transitional architectural philosophy, one that prioritizes adaptation to environment so completely that structure becomes indistinguishable from terrain. There are also questions about how life functioned within such a carved environment. Natural light penetrates only certain sections of the city. Air circulation, water management, and seasonal changes would have directly affected daily life in ways not immediately visible in the remaining ruins. How did inhabitants navigate these constraints? What social or technological systems allowed a city carved into exposed earth to function as a Silk Road hub for centuries? Even today, standing among the ruins, one encounters not emptiness but structured absence. Doorways open into hollowed rooms. Streets run between eroded walls that still suggest movement and habitation. The city feels paused, but not entirely gone. And perhaps that is what makes Jiaohe particularly striking. It is not a ruin in the conventional sense of collapsed architecture, but a slow transformation of built space back into land. A reversal of construction that continues without interruption. The city is still disappearing, not suddenly, but continuously, shaped by wind, rain, and geological patience. What kind of civilization builds an entire urban center by carving into living earth, knowing it will eventually erode back into the landscape? And as Jiaohe continues its quiet return to the soil of the Turpan Basin, one final question remains suspended in its hollowed streets. Are we witnessing the remains of a lost city, or the final stage of a transformation that was always meant to continue beyond human presence itself? From the eroded silence of the Jiaohe Ruins, where entire streets were carved into living earth and slowly surrendered back to wind and time, the journey moves once more into deeper layers of mystery, beyond the Silk Road corridors of Central Asia and into the vast, shifting deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Here, the landscape changes again. Stone cities give way to sand, rivers vanish, horizons blur, and history itself becomes harder to anchor. In the remote deserts of southern Arabia, where dunes stretch without clear boundary and heat distorts the horizon into wavering illusion, lies the legend of Ubar, often referred to in modern storytelling as the lost city of the sands. Unlike many archaeological sites that present visible ruins, Ubar exists at the intersection of history, oral tradition, and partial discovery. It is a place that is at once real, reconstructed, and still partially elusive. For centuries, Ubar was known primarily through ancient texts and regional oral traditions. It appears in references connected to the broader trade networks of the Arabian Peninsula, particularly those associated with incense routes that carried frankincense and myrrh across deserts and toward Mediterranean and Mesopotamian civilizations. These routes were vital, shaping economies and cultures across vast distances where survival depended on navigation through some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Classical writers and later historians sometimes referred to a wealthy desert settlement associated with caravan trade, a place said to have been rich enough to command influence over regional routes. Over time, these references merged with legend, and Ubar became known less as a clearly located city and more as a symbol of vanished prosperity swallowed by desert sands. For centuries, its physical location remained uncertain. It was not until the late 20th century that modern archaeological investigation, combined with satellite imaging and remote sensing technology, began to suggest possible locations of ancient caravan hubs buried beneath shifting dunes. In the early 1990s, exploratory work in Oman identified subsurface structures and ancient road networks converging toward a site in the Rub al-Khali Desert. Excavations revealed evidence of fortifications, wells, and architectural remains consistent with a once active settlement. This discovery is often associated with what is now called Ubar, or Iram of the Pillars, though the relationship between the archaeological site and the legendary city remains a subject of interpretation rather than definitive identification. The uncovered structures suggest a settlement that was not merely transient, but organized and sustained. Stone foundations indicate planned construction. Water access systems point to attempts at managing one of the most critical resources in desert life. Caravan routes converging at the site suggest that it functioned as a node within broader trade networks stretching across Arabia and beyond. Yet even with these findings, Ubar resists simple classification. The site appears to have been abandoned or destroyed in a way that left limited continuous occupation layers. Some interpretations suggest that environmental factors played a decisive role. The collapse or depletion of underground water sources could have rendered the settlement unsustainable. In desert environments, where survival is tightly bound to access to water, such changes can transform thriving hubs into empty ruins within relatively short historical timeframes. But the narrative of Ubar is not defined solely by environmental explanation. The presence of fortifications and structured planning suggests a settlement of considerable importance. Why would such a strategically located trade hub, situated along critical incense routes, decline so completely? Was it gradual abandonment due to economic shifts, or a more abrupt disruption of regional trade systems? Some interpretations connect Ubar's disappearance to broader changes in ancient trade dynamics. As maritime routes expanded and overland caravan networks declined, certain desert cities may have lost their central function. In this view, Ubar is not an isolated mystery, but part of a larger transformation in how goods, wealth, and cultural exchange moved across the ancient world. Yet the legend of Ubar persists in ways that exceed purely economic explanation. In regional tradition, Ubar is sometimes described not just as a city, but as a place of extraordinary wealth and architectural grandeur, a city of pillars, whose scale and beauty surpassed ordinary settlements. These descriptions have led some to suggest that the archaeological remains represent only a fragment of a larger or more complex settlement system, possibly dispersed across multiple locations rather than concentrated in a single urban center. Others have proposed more speculative interpretations, suggesting that Ubar represents a symbolic memory of multiple caravan cities rather than one fixed location. In this view, Ubar may function less as a singular historical city and more as a composite narrative reflecting the rise and fall of interconnected trade hubs across shifting desert routes. Even within mainstream archaeology, there is acknowledgement that the identification of Ubar remains partly interpretive. While physical evidence confirms the existence of a significant settlement in the region, linking it definitively to the legendary accounts requires careful separation of material findings from literary tradition. And yet, it is precisely this overlap between archaeology and legend that continues to draw attention. Walking through the excavated remains attributed to Ubar, one encounters outlines of structures partially reclaimed by sand. Stone fragments emerge from dunes as if suspended between visibility and disappearance. The desert does not preserve ruins in the same way as stone or clay-rich environments. Instead, it absorbs them, shifting their outlines with every passing windstorm. There is a sense that what remains is only a partial imprint, an archaeological echo rather than a complete record. What kind of settlement becomes so deeply embedded in both historical trade networks and mythic memory that its identity survives even when its physical form does not? And as researchers continue to map buried structures beneath the sands of Arabia, one question remains suspended in the shifting desert light. Are we uncovering the remains of a single lost city, or fragments of a wider network of desert civilizations that once thrived and then quietly dissolved into the landscape itself? From the shifting dunes of the Arabian deserts, where the idea of a lost city lingers more in fragments than in certainty, the journey turns once more across continents and elevations, away from sand and heat, and toward a landscape carved not by wind or water alone, but by stone shaped high into the mountains themselves. The narrative rises, both literally and figuratively, into thinner air and sharper horizons, where human effort appears pressed directly into the bones of the earth. High above the city of Cusco in the Peruvian Andes, where the mountains fold into one another in vast, layered ridges, stands the monumental complex of Sacsayhuamán. At first approach, it does not resemble a conventional archaeological site. It feels instead like a deliberate interruption in the landscape, massive terraces of stone walls stepping across the hillside, arranged in zigzag formations that follow no simple architectural grid. The stones themselves dominate the experience. Some are so large that their scale defies immediate comprehension, weighing tens or even hundreds of tons. Yet they are fitted together with a precision that leaves no visible mortar between them. The edges interlock in complex, irregular geometries, curves meeting angles, surfaces meeting surfaces in a way that suggests careful adaptation rather than standardized repetition. This is not a structure that hides its difficulty of construction. It announces it. Archaeologically, Sacsayhuamán is associated with the Inca civilization, particularly during the 15th century AD, under the expansion of the Inca Empire. It is widely interpreted as a ceremonial and military complex, part of a broader network of sites surrounding the imperial capital of Cusco. The Inca were master builders, known for their ability to integrate architecture into mountainous terrain, adapting construction techniques to seismic activity and steep gradients. Sacsayhuamán is often described as a fortress, though this label only partially captures its complexity. While defensive functions are possible, its elevated position overlooking Cusco would certainly have strategic value. There is also evidence suggesting ceremonial use. Open plazas, ritual spaces, and carefully designed alignments hint at functions beyond warfare alone. Yet even within established interpretations, the site raises questions that resist simple resolution. The precision of the stonework is one of its most striking features. Blocks are cut in such a way that they fit together without uniform shape, yet still interlock seamlessly. The irregular edges appear intentional rather than accidental, designed to distribute weight and resist seismic movement. In a region prone to earthquakes, this form of construction demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of structural stability. But the question remains: how were such massive stones transported and positioned at this altitude? The quarrying sites are located several kilometers away, at lower elevations. Moving stones of such scale through mountainous terrain would have required extensive labor coordination, engineering knowledge, and logistical planning. Various mainstream explanations suggest the use of ramps, ropes, wooden rollers, and coordinated human effort over long periods of time. The Inca, after all, had no use of wheeled vehicles in the traditional sense, yet achieved feats of construction that rival some of the most advanced ancient engineering systems known. And yet, when standing before the walls of Sacsayhuamán, the scale challenges even these explanations. The irregularity of the stone shapes introduces another layer of complexity. Unlike standardized blocks, each stone appears individually adapted to its position. This suggests a construction process that was highly responsive, possibly involving continuous shaping and adjustment during placement, rather than prefabricated uniform elements. Was this purely a matter of craftsmanship, or did it reflect a construction philosophy fundamentally different from later architectural traditions? Beyond the physical structure lies the question of purpose. Some interpretations emphasize Sacsayhuamán's role in ceremonial life. Historical accounts from the early colonial period describe large gatherings, rituals, and festivals taking place in and around the complex. The nearby city of Cusco was the political and spiritual center of the Inca world, and Sacsayhuamán may have functioned as an extension of that symbolic geography, an elevated space where state power and cosmological order intersected. In Inca worldview, the landscape itself was not passive. Mountains were considered sacred entities, often associated with protective spirits. Building into and upon such terrain may have carried meanings that extend beyond utility. Sacsayhuamán, in this sense, may not simply occupy the mountain. It may participate in its identity. Yet even this interpretation leaves certain aspects open. The sheer scale of the walls, particularly the three-tiered zigzag formations, suggests a level of labor organization that required sustained coordination across large populations. What social systems enabled such mobilization? How were resources allocated, and how was construction knowledge transmitted and maintained across generations? Some researchers suggest that Sacsayhuamán may represent a culmination of long-developing Andean architectural traditions, rather than an isolated achievement of the Inca alone. Earlier cultures in the region, such as the Kilki, may have contributed foundational elements that were later expanded and refined. In this view, the site becomes part of a continuum rather than a sudden architectural emergence. There are also interpretive perspectives that focus on the experiential dimension of the site. Moving through Sacsayhuamán, the scale of the stones alters perception. Walls rise and fall in rhythmic sequence. Open spaces frame the city below. The alignment of structures interacts with light and shadow throughout the day, changing the visual impact of the complex depending on time and weather. Was this simply an architectural outcome of function and terrain, or was there an intentional shaping of sensory experience? Even today, certain stones at Sacsayhuamán attract particular attention due to their complexity of carving. Some feature multiple angles and surfaces that appear to interlock with adjacent stones in highly intricate ways. The famous puzzle-like construction has led to ongoing discussion about the level of planning and adaptability involved in their placement. Mainstream archaeology attributes this to advanced stonemasonry skills developed over generations, combined with careful fitting techniques and extensive labor. There is no need, within this framework, to invoke lost technologies or external influences. And yet, the precision and scale continue to inspire questions about the limits of what is possible using only human coordination and traditional tools. Outside academic consensus, more speculative interpretations occasionally emerge, suggesting that sites like Sacsayhuamán preserve knowledge systems that were highly advanced but transmitted in forms we no longer fully recognize: oral, spatial, and embodied, rather than written or codified. These interpretations remain outside mainstream archaeology, but they reflect the broader sense of wonder the site continues to evoke. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of Sacsayhuamán is not any single feature, but the relationship between stone, landscape, and human intention. The structure does not sit apart from the mountain. It appears to extend it, as though the natural formation and human construction were part of a single continuous process. And so, even after centuries of study, excavation, and interpretation, the complex remains only partially translated into modern understanding. What kind of society develops the ability to shape multi-ton stones into interlocking forms at high altitude, integrates them into a sacred landscape, and constructs an architectural system that continues to resist simple explanation? And as the walls of Sacsayhuamán continue to stand above Cusco, enduring earthquakes, time, and observation, one final question remains open in the cold Andean air. Are we looking at the peak of Inca engineering, or at the surface of an architectural tradition whose full depth has not yet been revealed? From the immense stone architecture of Sacsayhuamán, where mountains themselves seem to have been reorganized into human intention, the journey turns once more across continents and oceans. The high Andes fade into memory, replaced by the muted greens and rolling contours of the English countryside. Landscapes that appear gentle at first glance, yet conceal some of the most enigmatic prehistoric constructions in Europe. In the heart of Wiltshire, England, rising quietly from the flat expanse of the Marlborough Downs, stands the monumental earthwork known as Silbury Hill. At first approach, it does not resemble a human-made structure at all. There are no visible walls, no stone surfaces, no obvious architectural features. Instead, there is only a vast, grass-covered mound, smooth, symmetrical, and strangely deliberate in its presence against the surrounding landscape. It is the largest prehistoric artificial mound in Europe. Standing approximately 30 meters high and spanning more than 100 meters in diameter at its base, Silbury Hill rises with a quiet authority that belies its simplicity. It is not a ruin in the traditional sense, because there is nothing visibly broken or collapsed. It is complete in its form, yet its purpose remains profoundly unclear. Unlike temples, tombs, or settlements, it offers no obvious entrance, no internal chambers that have been definitively confirmed, no inscriptions or symbolic carvings to guide interpretation. And yet, it is undeniably the product of immense human labor. Constructed during the late Neolithic period, around 2400 BC, Silbury Hill is believed to have been built using chalk, gravel, clay, and soil transported from the surrounding landscape. Archaeological estimates suggest that its construction required the movement of hundreds of thousands of tons of material. This was not a casual undertaking. It would have demanded coordinated effort over generations, sustained organization, and a shared cultural motivation strong enough to justify such an extraordinary investment of energy. But what exactly was being built? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that Silbury Hill was not a burial mound, despite earlier assumptions, nor a defensive structure. Instead, it is often described as a ceremonial or symbolic monument, possibly connected to the wider prehistoric landscape of Wiltshire, which includes nearby sites such as Avebury and other Neolithic earthworks. In this context, Silbury Hill is not an isolated feature, but part of a broader ritual geography. The landscape itself seems deliberately structured. Ancient pathways, stone circles, and earthworks form a network that suggests movement, gathering, and ritual activity across a wide area. Silbury Hill sits within this system not as a focal point in the conventional sense, but as a silent presence, visible from surrounding sites, yet offering no clear explanation of its own function. Its internal structure adds another layer of complexity. Excavations carried out over the centuries have revealed a series of internal layers, carefully constructed terraces of chalk and earth, built up in stages rather than as a single continuous mass. This suggests a long-term construction process, possibly involving multiple phases of planning and modification. The hill was not simply thrown together. It was shaped with intent, revised over time, and maintained through sustained effort. But despite these investigations, no central chamber or burial deposit has been definitively identified. Some early excavations in the 18th and 19th centuries suggested the possibility of tunnels or voids within the structure, but later studies have not confirmed any significant internal architecture. Instead, Silbury Hill appears largely solid, a carefully engineered mound without an obvious internal purpose. This absence is, in itself, part of the mystery. Why would a society invest such enormous effort into constructing a monument that does not appear to contain anything, does not clearly mark a burial, and does not function as a defensive or residential structure? One interpretation suggests that Silbury Hill may have functioned as a symbolic axis within the Neolithic landscape, a physical representation of cosmological or seasonal cycles. Its perfect geometry and prominent visibility could indicate a role in marking time, territory, or ritual alignment. In this view, the hill is not meant to contain meaning inside it, but to express meaning through its form and presence. There are also interpretations that focus on process rather than function. The act of building Silbury Hill may have been as important as the finished structure itself. If construction took place over generations, it may have served as a long-term communal activity, an ongoing project that reinforced social cohesion, identity, and shared purpose. In this sense, the hill becomes not a static monument, but a record of collective effort across time. Yet even these interpretations leave certain questions open. The precision of its shape is striking. Despite being constructed from loose materials, Silbury Hill maintains a remarkably consistent profile. Its slopes are smooth and balanced, suggesting careful control over material distribution and structural stability. How was such geometric regularity achieved without modern surveying tools? What methods allowed for this level of architectural consistency in a pre-literate society? Some researchers propose that knowledge of construction techniques was transmitted through embodied practice rather than written instruction, through repeated communal labor, oral tradition, and experiential learning. Others suggest that prehistoric builders may have had a more intuitive understanding of landscape engineering than is often assumed, developed through long-term engagement with their environment. Outside mainstream archaeology, Silbury Hill has attracted a range of speculative interpretations. Some have proposed astronomical alignments or symbolic representations of cosmic structures. Others suggest that it may have functioned as a territorial marker of unusual scale, asserting control or identity over a wide region. These ideas remain outside established academic consensus, but they reflect the broader challenge posed by the monument. Its scale exceeds its apparent function. Even erosion itself seems to reveal and conceal its form simultaneously. Over thousands of years, natural processes have softened its edges, yet its overall shape remains intact. It is as though the hill resists disappearance, maintaining its presence despite the slow pressure of time. Modern conservation efforts have also revealed something important. Silbury Hill is not static. Beneath its surface, subtle shifts in soil and structure continue to occur. Water movement, seasonal changes, and underlying geology all interact with the monument in ways that are still being studied. The hill is not simply an ancient object. It is an ongoing geological and archaeological system. Standing at its base today, the experience is disorienting in its simplicity. There are no grand entrances, no visible chambers, no inscriptions to decode. Only a vast, grassy slope rising into the sky, shaped by human hands more than 4 millennia ago. And that absence of explicit meaning becomes its own kind of presence. What kind of society constructs a monument of such immense scale without leaving a clear record of its purpose? And as Silbury Hill continues to stand quietly within the Wiltshire landscape, unchanged in form yet still evolving in interpretation, one question remains suspended in the still air above its slopes. Are we looking at a monument whose meaning has been lost, or one whose purpose was never meant to be contained in explanation at all? From the smooth, engineered slopes of Silbury Hill, where Neolithic builders raised an artificial mountain whose purpose still resists certainty, the journey shifts once more across both geography and time. The English landscape, with its quiet earthworks and hidden geometry, gives way to something more linear, more militarized, more explicitly shaped by an empire at its edge. The narrative moves north, toward colder winds, harsher ground, and a frontier that once marked the boundary of one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. In northern England, where rolling hills meet wind-swept valleys and the sky often feels unbroken and vast, lies the Roman frontier site of Vindolanda. At first sight, the remains appear subdued. Low stone walls, partially reconstructed buildings, and the faint outlines of a settlement that once operated at the very edge of Roman-controlled territory in Britain. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies one of the most extraordinary archaeological windows into daily life in the Roman world. Vindolanda was not a grand capital or ceremonial center. It was a military fort, part of a chain of installations built to secure and monitor the northern frontier of Roman Britain, near what would later become the line of Hadrian's Wall. Established around the late 1st century AD and occupied in various phases for several centuries, Vindolanda served as a garrison town, a supply hub, and a living community of soldiers, families, traders, and administrators. What makes Vindolanda exceptional is not only its strategic role, but the extraordinary preservation of organic materials found within its anaerobic soil conditions. Unlike many Roman sites where only stone remains survive, Vindolanda has yielded an unparalleled archive of everyday life preserved in wood, leather, fabric, and ink. These fragile materials, sealed beneath layers of clay and soil, have survived almost 2,000 years with remarkable clarity. Among the most famous discoveries are the Vindolanda tablets, thin wooden writing tablets inscribed with ink. These documents provide a rare, intimate glimpse into the thoughts, routines, and concerns of people living on the frontier of empire. They include military reports, supply requests, personal correspondence, and even social invitations. One tablet famously records a request for more socks and underwear, an ordinary human detail that collapses the distance between modern perception and ancient life. And yet, even in this extraordinary clarity, there remains a deeper sense of distance. Vindolanda existed at the edge of a vast imperial system. It was part of a network of forts, roads, and communication lines that extended across Britain and connected to the broader Roman world. But this was also a frontier of uncertainty. The northern boundary of Roman Britain was not a fixed line in the modern sense, but a fluctuating zone of control, negotiation, and conflict with local populations beyond imperial authority. The nearby construction of Hadrian's Wall in the early 2nd century A.D., under Emperor Hadrian, formalized this frontier into a more visible boundary. The wall, stretching across northern Britain, was not simply a defensive barrier. It functioned as a controlled passage system, regulating movement, trade, and military presence. Vindolanda sat just south of this line, acting as a support and supply base for the troops stationed along it. But what does it mean to live at the edge of an empire? The archaeological record at Vindolanda suggests a complex, layered community. While it was a military installation, it was not exclusively inhabited by soldiers. Evidence shows the presence of women, children, craftsmen, and merchants. This challenges earlier assumptions that Roman forts were purely masculine, martial spaces. Instead, Vindolanda appears as a semi-permanent settlement where military and civilian life intertwined. Buildings within the fort changed over time. Timber structures were replaced with stone. Layouts were modified. Storage facilities expanded. Roads were repaired and rerouted. This continuous adaptation reflects not a static outpost, but a living settlement responding to changing political and environmental conditions. And yet, despite the abundance of preserved material, some aspects of Vindolanda remain difficult to fully reconstruct. The written tablets, while revealing, are fragmentary. Many are incomplete, their edges broken or eroded. Others are difficult to interpret due to fading ink or damage. They offer glimpses rather than full narratives. A request here, a report there, a personal note in passing. The result is a mosaic of daily life that is vivid but incomplete, intimate but partial. What lies between these fragments is as important as what survives. Mainstream archaeology interprets Vindolanda as a well-documented example of Roman frontier life. It illustrates the administrative efficiency of the Roman military, the integration of civilian and military populations, and the logistical complexity of maintaining a distant frontier. The preservation of organic materials makes it one of the most important sites for understanding everyday life in the Roman Empire. Yet even within this clarity, deeper questions emerge. Why did such detailed records survive here in particular? The soil conditions provide a partial answer, but the sheer volume and diversity of material suggest a highly active, densely inhabited site. Was Vindolanda unusually well documented compared to other forts, or does it simply reveal a standard that has been lost elsewhere due to less favorable preservation conditions? There is also the question of emotional life at the frontier. The tablets reveal not only administrative concerns but personal relationships, expressions of absence, and subtle traces of social connection. Letters between family members, requests for goods, and notes of invitation suggest a community negotiating distance, both geographic and emotional, from the center of imperial power. Outside strictly academic interpretation, some reflections focus on the psychological landscape of frontier life. Living at the edge of a vast empire, in a region marked by shifting boundaries and intermittent conflict, may have shaped a distinct cultural identity, neither fully central nor fully peripheral. Vindolanda, in this sense, becomes a space of in-between existence, and yet there are still layers of uncertainty. Large areas of the site remain unexcavated. Seasonal rebuilding and shifting occupation phases suggest that much of Vindolanda's full complexity lies beneath later layers of construction. Each excavation season reveals new structures, new tablets, new fragments of daily life that alter previous interpretations. Even the frontier itself, defined by Hadrian's Wall, was not a fixed line, but a dynamic zone. Control shifted over time. Military presence expanded and contracted. Local interactions with surrounding communities were likely more complex than simple opposition or separation. Standing among the reconstructed walls today, one can sense both order and fragmentation. The outlines of barracks, storage rooms, and administrative buildings suggest structure and discipline. Yet the scattered nature of discoveries suggests a lived reality far richer and more fluid than any single reconstruction can fully capture. Vindolanda does not present itself as a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is not lost, nor hidden, nor erased. Instead, it is overexposed in fragments, so well preserved that it becomes difficult to assemble into a single coherent narrative without leaving gaps. And perhaps that is where its deeper mystery resides. What does it mean to know a place so intimately through fragments, yet still lack a complete understanding of the lives it contained? And as archaeologists continue to uncover tablets, structures, and artifacts from beneath the northern soil of Britain, one final question remains suspended in the cold air of the frontier. Are we reading the full story of Vindolanda, or only the surviving pages of a much larger, still unfinished record of life at the edge of an empire? From the cold frontier air of Vindolanda, where Roman lives once unfolded in ink, timber, and weathered stone along the edge of empire, the journey turns once more across continents and climates. The northern mists of Britain dissolve into memory, replaced by an entirely different horizon, one shaped not by temperate hills or imperial boundaries, but by salt deserts, shifting coastlines, and a silence that feels geologically deep. On the edge of the Great Rann of Kutch in present-day India, where land and salt marsh blur into an almost lunar expanse, lies the ancient city of Dholavira. From above, the site appears as a geometric imprint etched into a stark white landscape. Rectangular divisions, reservoirs, streets, and enclosures emerge with unusual clarity, as if the city was not simply abandoned, but carefully preserved in the memory of the earth itself. Dholavira was one of the major urban centers of the Indus Valley civilization, flourishing between roughly 3000 BC and 1500 BC. Unlike many ancient cities that grew around riverbanks or fertile plains, Dholavira was established in an extreme environment, an island-like settlement surrounded by seasonal water flows and vast salt flats. Survival here was not guaranteed. It had to be engineered. And that is where Dholavira begins to stand apart. The city reveals a level of urban planning that is both precise and expansive. It is divided into multiple sectors, often described as a citadel, middle town, and lower town, each with distinct architectural and functional characteristics. Massive stone walls define these zones, creating a structured hierarchy of space that suggests not only administrative organization, but a sophisticated understanding of urban design principles. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of Dholavira is its water management system. In a landscape where rainfall is seasonal and unpredictable, water is not merely a resource, it is the foundation of survival. Dholavira's builders constructed an extensive network of reservoirs, channels, and storage tanks designed to capture and retain monsoon water. Some of these reservoirs are carved directly into bedrock, while others are reinforced with carefully placed stone linings. The scale of this system suggests long-term planning and an intimate understanding of hydrology in an arid environment. But even this engineering achievement raises deeper questions. How did a civilization more than 4,000 years ago develop such a complex water conservation system in one of the harshest environments of the ancient world? Was this knowledge developed incrementally over generations, or was it part of a broader shared tradition across the Indus Valley region? Mainstream archaeology interprets Dholavira as a peak example of Indus urban planning, one of several major cities, alongside sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, that collectively demonstrate a highly organized and interconnected civilization. The absence of obvious royal palaces or monumental inscriptions suggests a form of governance that may have been less centralized than later ancient empires, possibly relying on distributed administrative systems or civic organization. And yet, despite the clarity of its layout, Dholavira remains strangely silent in one critical aspect: language. The Indus script, found on seals and inscriptions across the civilization, including Dholavira, remains undeciphered. Short sequences of symbols appear on seals, pottery, and architectural markers, but no bilingual inscription or definitive key has yet been discovered to unlock their meaning. As a result, the voices of Dholavira's inhabitants remain partially inaccessible, present in form but absent in translation. What kind of city speaks in symbols that still resist interpretation after millennia? Within the excavated remains of Dholavira, archaeologists have identified sophisticated craft production areas, trade goods, and evidence of standardized measurement systems. This suggests that the city was not isolated, but part of a wider network of exchange across the Indus Valley civilization and beyond. Materials such as semi-precious stones, shell artifacts, and metals indicate long-distance trade connections stretching toward Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Yet even with these connections, the sudden decline of the Indus civilization remains one of archaeology's enduring questions. Around 1500 BC, Dholavira, along with many other Indus sites, was gradually abandoned. The reasons are still debated. Environmental change is often cited as a major factor. Shifts in river systems, prolonged droughts, or changes in monsoon patterns that disrupted agricultural foundations. In a city so dependent on water management, even small climatic shifts could have had profound consequences. But environmental explanations alone do not fully account for the complexity of the transition. Some areas of the city show signs of gradual abandonment, while others suggest more abrupt cessation of activity. Structures were left unfinished in certain phases. Some reservoirs appear to have been in use until late stages of occupation, while other parts of the urban fabric show reduced maintenance over time. This uneven pattern suggests a slow transformation rather than a single catastrophic event. And yet, the final outcome is the same. A city once carefully organized for survival in an extreme environment eventually fell silent. What makes Dholavira particularly compelling is not only its rise, but the precision with which it was built into its environment. Unlike cities that impose themselves upon landscapes, Dholavira appears to negotiate with it. Every wall, reservoir, and street seems to respond to environmental constraints rather than resist them. The city does not dominate its surroundings. It adapts to them. Some interpretations suggest that this reflects a broader philosophical approach within the Indus Valley civilization, one that prioritized balance between human settlement and natural systems. If so, Dholavira may represent not only technical mastery, but an early form of environmental urbanism, where sustainability was embedded into the very structure of the city. Other perspectives, more speculative in nature, suggest that the precision of Indus urban planning indicates a level of coordination and knowledge transmission that is still not fully understood. The consistency of measurements across distant sites, the standardized layout patterns, and the repeated use of similar construction principles raise questions about how such information was shared across vast regions without known centralized authority or deciphered written records. Even within academic frameworks, there is acknowledgement that the Indus civilization does not fit easily into later models of state formation. It is highly organized, yet largely non-monumental. Technologically sophisticated, yet linguistically opaque. Urbanized, yet lacking clear evidence of centralized royal structures. Dholavira sits at the center of these contradictions. Walking through its remains today, one encounters a city that feels both precise and incomplete. The outlines of streets are still visible, cutting clean geometric lines through the salt-crusted earth. Reservoirs remain as hollowed spaces, still capable of collecting water in seasonal rains. Defensive walls rise in structured tiers, marking boundaries that once defined civic space. And yet, there is no sound of occupation. No written language that can fully explain its functions. No surviving narrative from its inhabitants that can clarify its internal logic. Only structure remains. And structure, in this case, is not enough to resolve meaning. What kind of civilization constructs a vast, highly organized urban center in one of the most challenging environments of the ancient world, develops advanced systems of water management and urban planning, and then disappears, leaving behind a script that cannot yet be read? And as Dholavira continues to emerge from beneath the salt and silence of the Rann of Kutch, one final question remains suspended in the still desert air. Are we looking at the remains of a lost city, or at the fragment of an entire worldview that still waits to be understood through a language we have not yet learned how to read? From the salt-flattened silence of Dholavira, where an entire city once engineered survival against an unforgiving landscape, the journey moves once more along the vast timeline of the Indus Valley civilization. The desert winds that sweep across the Rann of Kutch seem to carry fragments of a shared memory, of cities aligned with precision, water systems carved into stone, and scripts that still resist translation. That thread continues, but now it leads deeper into the heart of one of antiquity's most enigmatic urban centers. Far to the northwest, along the ancient floodplains of the Indus River, lie the remains of Mohenjo-daro. From above, the site appears as a geometric pattern emerging from the earth. Rectilinear streets, grid-like neighborhoods, and raised platforms that suggest intentional urban planning on a remarkable scale. Yet at ground level, the city feels quieter, more fragmented, as if only partial echoes of its former life remain embedded in the soil. Mohenjo-daro, meaning Mound of the Dead in later interpretations, was one of the largest cities of the Indus Valley civilization, flourishing between approximately 2600 BC and 1900 BC. At its height, it was home to tens of thousands of people, making it one of the earliest major urban centers in human history. Unlike many ancient cities that grew organically over time, Mohenjo-daro appears to have been built with an unusually consistent plan, streets laid out in a grid, buildings constructed from standardized baked bricks, and a sophisticated drainage system integrated into nearly every residential block. This sense of order is one of its most defining features. The city is divided into distinct sectors. Elevated platforms, often referred to as the citadel, contain large structures whose functions remain partially interpreted, possibly administrative, ritual, or communal in nature. Below them lies the lower city, a dense network of residential buildings, workshops, and streets. Each house appears to have had access to a private well and a drainage system, suggesting a level of urban hygiene and infrastructure that was extraordinary for its time. Water flows not only through the river outside the city, but through its very design. Covered drains run beneath streets, connected to household waste systems. Wastewater appears to have been channeled away from living spaces with careful engineering. Some houses feature bathing areas with waterproofed floors, indicating an emphasis on controlled water use and sanitation. This level of urban planning suggests not only technical capability, but a shared civic understanding of public infrastructure. And yet, despite this clarity of design, Mohenjo-daro remains silent in its most essential dimension. No clear palace structures have been identified. No monumental temples dominate the skyline. No royal tombs or clearly defined centers of political authority have been conclusively found. This absence challenges later assumptions about how complex cities are organized. Instead of centralized monumental power, Mohenjo-daro presents a more distributed urban form, one where order is embedded in infrastructure rather than expressed through towering structures. What kind of society builds a city of such scale and precision without leaving obvious signs of kings, rulers, or monumental authority? One of the most persistent mysteries of Mohenjo-daro lies in its written language. Thousands of small inscriptions have been discovered on seals, pottery, and tablets. The symbols are consistent across the wider Indus Valley civilization, yet they remain undeciphered. The sequences are typically short, often only a few characters long, leaving their meaning open to interpretation. Without a key to the script, the voices of Mohenjo-daro remain partially inaccessible. Administrative records, personal names, religious texts, and historical accounts, if they exist within these symbols, are still locked behind an unread language. It is a city that speaks, but has not yet been heard. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mohenjo-daro was a hub of trade and craft production. Beads made from semi-precious stones, metal tools, pottery, and seals indicate a complex economy with both local and long-distance exchange networks. Materials found at the site show connections extending toward Mesopotamia and other ancient regions, suggesting that Mohenjo-daro was part of a wider system of interregional interaction. And yet, despite this connectivity, the city eventually declined. Around 1900 BC, Mohenjo-daro was gradually abandoned. The reasons remain debated. Environmental change is often cited, shifts in river courses, changes in monsoon patterns, or prolonged drought conditions that disrupted agricultural foundations. In a city so dependent on the Indus River system, even subtle hydrological changes could have had profound consequences. Some evidence suggests that the river may have shifted its course over time, reducing access to reliable water sources. Others point to possible flooding events that may have damaged infrastructure and forced gradual relocation. Unlike narratives of sudden destruction, Mohenjo-daro appears to have experienced a slow withdrawal of population rather than an abrupt collapse. But even this explanation leaves unresolved tensions. Certain layers of the site show signs of reconstruction and continued adaptation, while others suggest abandonment in place. Some streets appear carefully maintained until late phases of occupation, while others show gradual deterioration. This uneven pattern complicates any single explanatory model. And then there are the artifacts that continue to invite interpretation beyond purely functional explanations. Small seals engraved with animals, symbols, and abstract motifs appear repeatedly across the site. Some feature creatures that combine realistic and stylized elements. Others show figures seated in what appears to be meditative posture, though interpretations of these images remain debated. Are these religious symbols, administrative markers, clan identifiers, or something else entirely? Without deciphered language, context remains partial. Mainstream archaeology understands Mohenjo-daro as one of the most advanced urban centers of its era, a civilization that achieved remarkable feats of planning, engineering, and social organization without leaving behind the kind of monumental inscriptions or royal records seen in other ancient cultures. Its sophistication lies not in monumental architecture, but in systems, water, drainage, streets, and standardized construction. Yet systems alone do not fully explain lived experience. What did daily life feel like in a city where order was embedded in infrastructure rather than expressed through monumental authority? How were decisions made in a society that appears highly organized, yet leaves no clear evidence of centralized rulers? And what cultural or intellectual frameworks allowed such consistent urban design across a vast civilization? Some interpret Mohenjo-daro as evidence of an unusually balanced urban model, one where civic planning prioritized collective functionality over individual display of power. Others suggest that the uniformity of design across Indus sites implies shared knowledge systems that were widely distributed rather than centrally controlled. There are also more speculative interpretations, though not widely accepted in academic circles, that point to the unresolved nature of Indus symbolism and architecture as evidence of lost or incomplete cultural frameworks, systems of meaning that have not survived in recognizable form. But even within strict archaeological interpretation, Mohenjo-daro remains incomplete. Its streets are visible, its houses are measurable, its drainage systems are traceable, and yet its inhabitants remain largely unknowable. The physical structure survives, but the social and intellectual life that animated it remains partially obscured. Walking through the exposed remains today, one encounters a city that feels both familiar and distant. The geometry of its layout suggests rational planning. The materials suggest durability. The infrastructure suggests care for daily life. And yet, there is no voice to explain how these elements were experienced by those who lived within them. Only the outlines remain. And outlines are always open to interpretation. What kind of civilization builds a vast urban network of such precision, sustains it for centuries, and then leaves behind a language that cannot yet be read and a social structure that resists clear definition? And as Mohenjo-daro continues to emerge from the layers of the Indus floodplain, one final question lingers in the still air above its silent streets. Are we looking at one of humanity's earliest great cities? Or at a fragment of a far more complex civilization whose full story has not yet been recovered from the earth? From the grid-like silence of Mohenjo-daro, where entire city blocks once functioned with a level of order that still challenges assumptions about early urban life, the journey shifts once again across continents and climates. The wide floodplains of the Indus fade into memory, replaced by the Atlantic winds of northern Europe, where stone, sea, and sky converge in a landscape shaped as much by water as by time itself. Off the coast of Brittany in northwestern France, in the Gulf of Morbihan, lies the small island of Gavrinis. At first glance, it appears unremarkable, an island of low vegetation and quiet shores, surrounded by tidal waters that shift with the rhythm of the sea. But beneath this modest exterior lies one of the most extraordinary Neolithic monuments in Europe. Hidden beneath a grassy mound at the island's center is a passage tomb constructed around 3,500 BC during the Neolithic period. Known for its extraordinary interior architecture, Gavrinis is not defined by what can be seen from the outside, but by what is revealed when one enters its narrow stone passageway. The structure is built entirely from massive slabs of stone, carefully arranged to form a long corridor leading to a central chamber. What makes Gavrinis exceptional is not only its construction, but its decoration. The interior stones are covered in intricate carvings, spirals, concentric circles, geometric motifs, and abstract patterns that cover nearly every available surface. These engravings are not random. They appear deliberately composed, carefully placed, and repeated across multiple stones in ways that suggest shared symbolic meaning. Yet despite decades of study, their exact significance remains uncertain. The passage leading into the chamber is narrow and carefully aligned. As one moves inward, the light from the outside world diminishes, replaced by the dim illumination of the interior. The experience is not immediate. It unfolds gradually as the carved symbols emerge from shadow, revealing themselves only in shifting light conditions. The monument seems designed not only to be seen, but to be experienced over time. At the center lies a burial chamber beneath the mound. Archaeological evidence confirms that Gavrinis functioned as a tomb, part of a broader tradition of Neolithic passage graves found across Atlantic Europe. Human remains and funerary deposits have been identified in similar structures in the region, suggesting that Gavrinis was part of a wider cultural practice of monumental burial architecture. And yet, even this explanation only partially captures the complexity of the site. The sheer effort required to construct Gavrinis is striking. The stones used in its passage and chamber were transported from distant locations, some likely originating several kilometers away on the mainland. This implies not only advanced logistical coordination, but also a strong cultural motivation for constructing a monument that would remain permanently embedded within the landscape. Why move such massive stones across land and sea to build a tomb on a small island? The island itself adds another layer of intrigue. Today, Gavrinis is separated from the mainland by water, but during the Neolithic period, sea levels and coastal geography may have been different. Some researchers suggest that the island was once more closely connected to surrounding land routes, while others emphasize its deliberate selection as a burial location, possibly chosen for its isolation and visibility within the Gulf. From certain vantage points, Gavrinis is part of a broader constellation of Neolithic sites in the region, including standing stones, alignments, and other passage tombs. The Gulf of Morbihan contains a dense concentration of prehistoric monuments, suggesting that this landscape held sustained ritual or cultural significance over many generations. In this context, Gavrinis may not be an isolated structure, but part of a larger ceremonial geography, an interconnected system of monuments aligned across land and water. The carvings inside Gavrinis remain one of its most debated features. Some patterns resemble motifs found at other Neolithic sites across Europe, suggesting shared symbolic traditions. Spirals, for example, appear repeatedly in prehistoric art, often interpreted as representations of cycles, movement, or transformation. Other motifs resemble axes, shields, or abstract forms that resist easy classification. Yet no written language accompanies these symbols. There is no key, no translation, no surviving explanation from the people who created them. The meaning of the carvings remains embedded in stone, detached from the cultural context that once gave them significance. What were these symbols meant to communicate? Mainstream archaeological interpretation tends to view Gavrinis as a ceremonial burial site associated with Neolithic belief systems centered on death, ancestry, and cosmology. In this view, the tomb reflects a worldview in which the dead were not simply removed from society, but integrated into the landscape through monumental architecture. The carvings may have functioned as symbolic expressions of identity, memory, or spiritual transformation, but even within this framework, uncertainty remains. The precision and density of the carvings suggest a level of symbolic importance that goes beyond simple decoration. Nearly every stone surface within the passage is covered, creating an immersive environment of repeated imagery. This raises questions about whether the carvings were intended to be read sequentially, experienced spatially, or interpreted through ritual movement within the tomb. Some researchers propose that light played a critical role in how the monument was experienced. As sunlight or torchlight moved through the passage, the carvings would shift in visibility, appearing and disappearing depending on angle and intensity. This suggests a dynamic relationship between architecture, symbolism, and perception, where meaning is not fixed in the stone itself, but emerges through interaction with light and movement. Others have suggested that Gavrinis may have functioned as more than a burial site. While its primary role as a tomb is widely accepted, some interpretations emphasize its possible role in ritual initiation, ancestral communication, or seasonal ceremonies. In this view, the passage into the chamber could represent a symbolic journey from one state of existence to another. Yet none of these interpretations fully resolve the mystery of its symbolism. The Neolithic builders of Gavrinis left no written records. Their language, if it existed in written form, has not survived. What remains is architecture and imagery, structures that preserve intention but not explanation. The result is a monument that communicates through form but not through explicit narrative. Even the act of entering Gavrinis today reinforces this sense of transition. The narrow passage forces a slow movement inward. The chamber is enclosed, quiet, and dim. The carvings appear gradually, not all at once, creating a layered experience that resists immediate comprehension. It is a space designed for attention, not speed. Modern archaeology continues to study Gavrinis in relation to other Neolithic sites across Europe, attempting to reconstruct broader cultural patterns. The similarities between monuments suggest shared traditions, possibly transmitted across generations and regions. Yet the absence of deciphered language means that interpretation remains grounded in material evidence rather than textual explanation. And material evidence, while powerful, is incomplete. What kind of society constructs a funerary monument that is not only architecturally complex, but visually saturated with symbolic imagery, placed on an island and aligned within a broader sacred landscape that still resists full interpretation? And as Gavrinis continues to endure beneath layers of earth, sea, air, and time, one question remains suspended within its carved stone corridors. Are we looking at a tomb built to house the dead, or at a carefully constructed threshold between worlds whose meaning was never meant to be fully translated, only experienced?